September 1887, Bitterroot Valley, Montana. A woman stands alone in the middle of a ranch yard. Stibitut's road-worn dress, 6 days of wilderness still on her hands. Around her, hired men who won't meet her eyes. A housekeeper frozen on the porch steps. A foreman gripping his hat like a weapon he hasn't decided to use. Across from her, a deputy on horseback. Badge catching the noon light, smiling in his hand. A document, legal, official looking. She reaches out and takes it. The yard goes silent. 1 line. 2. Something shifts behind her eyes. Not fear, something colder than fear. The deputy's smile holds, her hand doesn't. She looks up. And the man behind her, the largest man anyone in this valley has ever seen, goes completely, absolutely still. Nobody moves, nobody breathes. She opens her mouth. Pour yourself some coffee, friend. This one takes a minute to settle into, but once it doesn't let go. A woman walked into the Bitterroot Mountains alone, carrying 47 words and a valise with a broken latch. A man the size of a barn door had everything. Land, sky, cattle stretching past the horizon. And had somehow, without noticing the exact moment it happened, forgotten what it felt like when someone looked at him like he was just a person. Not a name. Not a balance in a safe. Not a cautionary tale the whole valley passed around at supper. Just a person. Before this story is done, a crooked deputy will overplay his hand in front of the wrong woman. A forged document will be taken apart, sentence by sentence, in front of everyone who matters in Millhaven County. And a man who had stopped believing the world contained genuine things will find out, in the most inconvenient possible way, that it does. By the time the snow comes, the whole valley will know May Callum's name, and they will say it the way people say the names of things they've decided to respect. That's where we're going. Here's how we get there. The train from Dayton, Ohio took 4 days, 2 connections, and 1 overnight stop in a town whose name May never caught before it deposited her. Dusty, stiff-spined, and considerably less certain than she'd been at departure, onto the platform at Millhaven Station in western Montana. September in Montana was not September anywhere else she had ever been. The light came in at an angle that made everything look slightly more deliberate than it probably was. The mountains to the north were already wearing their first snow at the peaks, white against a sky so blue it registered almost as a rebuke to the gray Ohio sky she'd left behind. The air was thin enough to notice, cold enough even at midday to remind a person that this season had opinions. She had 1 valise, brown leather, brass fittings on 3 of the 4 corners, the 4th having surrendered somewhere outside of Billings. She had the dress she was wearing, blue calico faded at the collar, and 1 other folded inside the bag. She had her mother's herb journal, its cover worn soft from years of daily handling, pressed flowers slowly flattening between pages of handwriting, so careful it looked like someone had been afraid of wasting paper. She had a tin-type photograph too faded now to make out the faces. She had a mother-of-pearl button she'd carried in her coat pocket since she was 11 years old for reasons she couldn't have explained to anyone living. And she had a letter, 47 words. She'd counted them on the train. 3 times, though she would have denied doing it more than once if anyone had asked. Dear Miss Callum, I am a man of few words and no pretense. I have land, a sound house, and need of a companion who is not afraid of hard winters or hard work. If you are willing to take a chance on a stranger, I will meet you at Millhaven Station on September 14th. B. Wade. 47 words from a man she had never met. She had answered that advertisement because his handwriting looked like someone who had learned to write late and taken it seriously ever since. She had answered it because Dayton had nothing left to offer her that wasn't already spoken for. She had answered it, if she was being fully honest with herself, because something in those words had felt like an actual person speaking rather than a performance of what a person was supposed to sound like. And she had found, in 6 years of making do alone in a city that did not notice her, that genuine things were rarer than gold and worth considerably more. The platform at Millhaven smelled of cold pine resin, and the metallic breath of rails still settling from the train's passage. The other passengers had dispersed into wagons and waiting arms. The platform, emptied, the station master, old, jaw working at something, fingernails dark with years of work, squinted at the letter like it might bite him. Wade, you say? He turned the paper over as though the back might offer clarification. B. Wade, that's what it says. Iron Star Ranch. He said those 3 words differently than he'd said the rest. The way people say the name of something bigger than a name. That's Burn Wade's outfit. owns the biggest stretch of mountain land in the whole Bitterroot. Nobody calls him by his first name twice, a pause that landed somewhere between information and pity. I ain't seen nobody from Iron Star come through today. Not yesterday neither. May folded the letter, put it back in her coat pocket next to the button, pressed her palm flat against outside of the pocket for just a moment, feeling the shape of both through the fabric, then let her hand drop. How far is the ranch? 6-7 hours on horseback, 12 on foot if the north road's soft from last week's rain. He squinted past her at the mountains. There's a closer route. Widow's Pass cuts through the foothills 2 miles west, 4 hours walking if you keep a good pace. Horse trail mostly, but passable on foot. Follow the creek once you're in the canyon. Can't lose it, he scratched his jaw. I wouldn't recommend it for a woman alone, but which direction? He pointed. She picked up her valise. He called after her as she reached the platform's edge. The next train east came through Thursday. She could wait. She could send word to the ranch. May stepped off the platform onto the packed dirt road without answering. Not because she was rude. Because she had learned, early and thoroughly, that some kinds of forward motion only worked if you didn't give yourself the option of going back. The road west of Millhaven ran flat for the first half mile, past a livery stable and 2 buildings that might have been houses or might have been something else. It was hard to say, and May didn't stop to find out. Then the land changed without warning into something that had no equivalent in Ohio. The pine trees began. Not the tame, spaced variety you'd find along a farmhouse lane, but actual Montana timber. Packed dense and running vertical up hillsides that were steeper than they appeared from the station platform. The undergrowth between the trunks was thick and dark, and gave off a smell like the inside of a church built by people who actually meant it. Her valise was heavier than its contents warranted. She switched hands every 20 minutes. She was not, by any fair measure, fragile. 6 years of cutting fabric and working a treadle machine 8 hours a day had built a particular kind of endurance that didn't look like much and didn't quit. Her hands were calloused from the scissors. Her back was straight because her mother had told her at 14 that she'd pay for slouching at 40, and May had believed her about most things. She walked with the economy of someone who had spent her life in shoes that were almost, but not quite right. She had not done much mountain walking. That was a separate category. The junction appeared after 40 minutes. The main north road curved to the right, wide and wagon-rutted. A narrower trail angled west through the trees, marked by nothing except a rough post someone had driven in and declined to label. A man was splitting wood near a lean-to setback from the junction, older, red-faced, swinging with the efficiency of someone who had done this particular job 10,000 times. He watched her approach without interrupting his rhythm. Widow's Pass. May gestured at the unmarked trail. Is this the way? He set his axe down, looked at her valise, looked at the sky with the automatic assessment of someone who lived by weather. Horse trail, not a foot road. But it's passable if you watch your footing on the upper section. Creek runs alongside most of the way. You can't get lost if you follow the water. He picked the axe back up. Keep moving and you'll beat dark, she thanked him. She took the left fork. For the first 20 minutes it was fine. The pass had a quality she couldn't immediately name. The canyon walls weren't dramatic the way she'd expected mountain scenery to be. They were modest, close, the kind of enclosure that felt less like confinement and more like the landscape leaning in to pay attention. The trees pressed from both sides, and the light filtered through them in long, pale columns that shifted when the wind moved the branches, so the whole pass seemed to breathe, in and out. Slow, like something sleeping. The creek appeared where the woodcutter said it would, cold and fast, and clear enough to see every individual stone on the bottom, rounded smooth by water that had been doing this work since before anyone had been around to notice. May followed it north. The trail wound and narrowed. She shifted the valise to her left hand and used her right to steady herself where the path angled up along the canyon wall, loose shale sliding under her boot heel. She was thinking about the letter. About what kind of man wrote 47 words and meant everyone. About what Dayton had been, a boarding house room with a window facing another building's wall, a treadle machine that needed oiling every Tuesday. 6 years of being useful to other people and invisible everywhere else. She had not left because she was unhappy exactly. She had left because she was 24 years old and she had started to understand the difference between a life and an arrangement, and she was not willing to mistake one for the other indefinitely. The horse appeared around a bend, and she stopped so fast she nearly lost her footing. Black, enormous, the kind of horse that made other horses look like they'd been assembled from the wrong materials. A white blaze running straight down the center of its face. Standing in the middle of the trail with its reins loose in the dirt, ears forward, dark eyes fixed on her with an attention that felt almost deliberate. Something was wrong with the right front foot. Wrapped with what looked like strips of fabric, a shirt, maybe, or a piece of saddlebag lining, and the horse was keeping weight off it with the careful stillness of an animal that had learned not to move unless necessary. May set down her valise. Took 2 slow steps forward, easy. Her voice came out quiet without her deciding on it. Easy now. The horse watched her. Twitched one ear, did not bolt. She was close enough now to see the saddle clearly. Good leather, dark with use along the seat and skirt where a rider's weight had polished it over years. And on the flap of the near saddlebag, tooled into the leather in a simple border, 3 letters ISR. Her hand had already reached for the reins before the letters fully registered. Then she was standing with the leather in her hand, the horse breathing warm against her cheek, and 3 initials sitting in the back of her mind like a door that had clicked open a 1/4 inch. Iron Star Ranch. She looked at the trail ahead. At the marks in the soft earth, hooves that had skidded, something large going sideways and then going down. Pale underseeds of small stones flipped up, which meant they'd been disturbed recently rather than turned by weather. A broken branch at chest height, where something had grabbed for purchase. A smear of dark leather against the rock face. She followed the marks. The boulders were around the next turn. A fresh scar on the canyon wall showed pale against the weathered stone above them. Rock that had come down not long ago, the edges still sharp. The trail marks led around and behind the largest of the fallen stones. May went around it and stopped. A hand jutted from beneath a slab of granite at an angle that told her everything about what was underneath. Palm upward. Fingers slightly curled. The slow opening and closing of someone trying to hold on to something slipping away. Calloused across the palm in the way that came from years of rope and tool handle and sustained outdoor work. A silver ring on the 3rd finger, plain, without any stone. Moving, just barely. But moving. May dropped her valise. She was over the smaller rocks before she had consciously chosen to move. One knee scraped through her skirt on the rough stone. Something tore at the hem. She didn't stop. The man lay on his side, half buried under the slide, face turned away from her, and he was breathing. She fixed on that first and held it like a reference point. The labored, shallow rise and fall of his chest. Present there, she got around to where she could see his face. She registered this in pieces, the way you take in something too large for a single glance. Even down, even half buried, even insensible, the scale of the man required a moment of recalibration. The shoulder she could see was broad enough to use as a writing surface. The arm stretched alongside him was roped with muscle down to that calloused, ring-bearing hand. Dark hair going silver at the temple, matted now with blood and dirt from the gash above his eyebrow. The source of the dark staining on the saddle, still seeping into the earth beneath his head. A jaw that looked like it had been built to withstand seasons. Several days of dark beard across it, and even in the complete looseness of unconsciousness, there was something in his face that had not entirely put its guard down. Some quality of watchfulness still present even in the absence of waking. His left leg was under a slab of granite the size of a cellar door. May looked at the slab, looked at her hands, thought, "This is not a thing one woman does alone, and then, there is nobody else here." And then, without giving herself the opportunity to reconsider. All right then. She found the branch first. A fallen pine, straight-grained, roughly the diameter of her forearm, and long enough to give real leverage if she could get the angle right. She dragged it through the loose rock, got it wedged under the near edge of the slab, found a smaller stone to use as a fulcrum. Her hands were already scraped from the climbing and the blood made her grip uncertain. She repositioned, tested, repositioned again. The slab was too heavy for the branch alone. She knew this before she tried. She tried anyway because you had to know for certain. She went back to the black horse. Spoke to it quietly while she worked the reins into a configuration she could use. Apologizing in the general direction of every horse she'd ever encountered for what she was about to ask of this one. The horse bore her adjustments with a patience she found almost moving, given the circumstances. She tied the reins to the branch, looked at the horse. "One step," she said. "Just one step forward." She put her weight on the branch. The horse leaned into the pull. The slab grated, an inch, then two. And under it, the man's leg shifted and he made a sound that was louder than anything he'd produced before, a sound from the bottom of something. And May locked her arms and kept her weight on the branch, and the horse kept moving, and the slab tipped sideways and slid and the leg came free. She sat down in the dirt. Her arms were shaking. She hadn't noticed until the eft stopped. His eyes were open, brown, dark enough to be nearly black, fixed on her face with the desperate focus of someone assembling the present from scattered pieces. His lips moved. Nothing came out. She went to him, got her arm under his head. The sheer weight of it was something she would think about later, when she had leisure for surprise, and retrieved the canteen from the saddle and tipped a small amount of water against his mouth. He swallowed, coughed once, wet and rattling. Swallowed again. Water, the word came out scraped raw, I know. Not too fast, his eyes moved across her face. She could watch the process, the slow deliberate work of a mind coming back to itself. Like watching someone cross ice, testing each step, deciding what was real, who. A cough cut the word in half, someone who was walking through this pass. "Don't move yet, your leg needs checking before you put weight on it." His eyes went to the tipped slab, to the branch, to the hoof prints in the soft earth. "Back to her, you moved that rock." The horse helped. She pressed 2 fingers along the line of his shin, watching his face rather than her hands. What she saw was pain. Considerable, honest pain, but not the specific escalating horror of bone grinding against bone. The ankle was already swelling to half again its size, the skin drawing tight and shiny, sprained badly, possibly torn, but not broken. The forehead wound was worse, deep, ragged at the edges, still seeping into the dirt. That one needed closing. "There's a cabin," she said. "You mentioned it before you went under." He blinked, something clarifying behind his eyes. "Half-mile. Follow the creek north. Can you ride?" A pause with real honesty in it. Not alone, May looked at the horse, looked at the man, made the calculation she'd been making her whole life. Not about what was easy, but about what was necessary regardless of whether it was easy. "Then we ride together," she got to her feet. "If your horse doesn't object." The horse did not object. It stood with the professional patience of an animal that had decided May was probably trustworthy and was willing to see how the situation developed. Getting Bern Wade onto his own horse was the hardest physical thing May Callum had ever done. And she had, at 17, moved a cast iron stove across a kitchen floor by herself because the delivery men had placed it wrong and she'd needed the cooking surface before they could return. This was harder. He was semi-conscious through most of it, which helped in some ways and complicated everything in others. She positioned his good leg, got her shoulder under his arm, used the boulder beside him as a staging point, talked at him in the low, steady voice she used when she needed to direct without alarming. "Put your hand here. Your foot? Yes. The stirrup? Yes. That one." Something cleared in his face at the right moment. His good leg found the stirrup. May shoved from below with everything she had, and he ended up draped across the saddle. She would never, in later recollection, be entirely clear on the physics of the final 18 inches. She took the reins and started walking. The creek ran alongside her, cold and certain and indifferent to everything happening on its bank. The light was failing. She couldn't see the sky through the canopy, but she felt the temperature dropping, the air taking on the quality of Montana dusk, which felt less like darkness arriving and more like warmth deliberately leaving. One foot, then the next. Her valise was back among the rocks where she'd dropped it. She didn't think about it. She'd go back for it, or she wouldn't, either way. The cabin appeared between one step and the next, or it seemed that way. A dark shape against the tree line, low and solid, built from logs by someone who had expected it to last through decades of hard winters. A stone chimney. 2 small windows with actual glass. The creek running within 20 feet of the west wall, and there, above the door, worked into a wooden crossbeam with what must have been considerable effort given the beam's weight. 3 carved letters, ISR. May looked at those letters for a moment, long enough to be sure she'd read them right. Then she looked at the man she was supporting, heavy against the horse, breathing in the shallow rhythm of someone running on what remained, and she pushed the door open and got him inside. The cabin held the accumulated cold of a place unheated for weeks, but it was dry and it was shelter, which was the only accounting that mattered right now. She found the fire materials on the first look, kindling stacked in the graduated manner of someone who did things properly as a matter of habit, not performance. Lamp oil and matches in a tin box on the mantel, a folded wool blanket smelling of cedar, supplies on the shelf, beans, cornmeal, dried beef, salt, a copper pot hanging from an iron hook above the hearth, Iron Star Ranch's outpost. Used by cowhands during the summer grazing season, she reasoned, and left provisioned for the fall. She was, by any definition, an emergency. She got the man onto the narrow cot against the wall. The process was somewhat easier than loading him onto the horse, and not as easy as she'd hoped. Pulled the blanket over him, and went back to the fire, 3 matches to get it going. Then she stood in front of it for 30 seconds with her eyes closed, letting the warmth reach her hands. Then she started working. The forehead wound needed closing. She had a sewing kit in her coat pocket, small needle, waxed thread, intended for fabric, and the principle was identical, the material not so different in the ways that mattered. She heated water in the copper pot, tore strips from her petticoat, worn cotton, the cleanest material she had access to, and cleaned the gash by the firelight with the methodical care of someone who understood that haste here would cost more than it saved, 8 stitches, even spacing. She worked slowly not because she was uncertain, but because the work required exactness, and she had spent 6 years learning that exactness could not be rushed without consequences. He came partway to consciousness at the 5th stitch. His hand moved with startling force, closing around her wrist, his eyes open but fixed on something she couldn't see. She held his shoulders down with her free arm. "You're safe. Lie still." He fought for a moment, the reflexive resistance of a body responding to a threat it couldn't identify, and then it drained out of him and he went loose against the cot. She tied off the 8th stitch, examined her work. Acceptable. The ankle came next. She went to the creek bank with the lamp and gathered yarrow, its flat white flower heads catching the light in the undergrowth near the water. Her mother's journal described its uses for swelling and inflammation in the plain factual tone of a woman who had learned these things because she couldn't afford the alternative, and had written them down so her daughter wouldn't have to learn everything from nothing. May crushed the leaves between 2 river stones she brought back inside, applied the preparation to the ankle with even pressure, wrapped the joint firmly but not tight with the remaining strips of petticoat. Elevated on a rolled blanket, not medicine, folk knowledge carefully applied, the only resource she had and the best one available. She sat down on the floor beside the cot and waited. The fever came in at about 2 in the morning. She'd been half dozing against the wall. The fire burned low. The cabin settled into its lowest temperature and the slow vocabulary of old timber at night. She woke to a change in his breathing, faster, shallower, the labor of a body fighting something on an interior front. She pressed her palm to his forehead and found it burning in the specific way that meant the body had decided this was serious. Right then, here we go. She fed the fire, got the water heating, changed the compress with the rotation her mother had drilled into her. Cool cloth, then warm, then cool again, the rhythm of keeping a fever from climbing while the body worked. He was restless through the worst hours, muttering in shapes that resembled language without quite being it, his hands moving at things she couldn't see. He grabbed her wrist once, hard, and she let him hold on without pulling away. She kept changing the compress with her other hand and said, without deciding to, "I'm here, lie still, I'm here." Eventually the grip loosened. His breathing slowed. Dawn came gray through the window. The fever broke somewhere in the dark before it, the heat fading under her palm in degrees too gradual to mark exactly, the way a stove cools after you stop feeding it. By the time the light had gone from black to the pale gold of early morning in the mountains, his skin had cooled to something closer to normal, and the shallow rasp of his breathing had settled. She had not slept. She sat on the floor with her back against the cot legs and watched the light come through the window and thought about 3 carved letters above a door and 47 words in her coat pocket, and the fact that these 2 things might be more connected than she'd initially understood. He woke at first proper light. She was at the hearth adding wood when she heard the change, the shift from the rhythms of unconsciousness to something with more intention behind it. She gave him a moment before she turned around, where, not a complete sentence, the beginning of orientation, a cabin, the one you mentioned before you went under. She poured water into the tin cup she'd found on the shelf, brought it to him. He took it with hands less steady than she'd have liked but steadier than a few hours ago. He drank with the careful economy of someone who understood rationing even half awake. His eyes moved around the room, taking in the compress on his forehead, the wrapped ankle elevated on the blanket, the fire, the strips of cloth she'd hung on the hearthstone to dry, the organized arrangement of the shelf. How does the leg feel? Like it met something heavier than itself. That's accurate. She sat down in the chair across from him. The bone is intact. The joint is another matter. You'll be off it for several days at minimum. The head wound I closed with 8 stitches. If you feel the stitches pulling, tell me. If you see redness spreading outward from the wound, tell me immediately. She paused. Are you hungry? He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. Not suspicion exactly, but something adjacent to wariness. The look of a man running an assessment of a situation he hadn't anticipated. Who are you? Someone who was walking through that pass. She held his gaze with the same directness she'd held onto since Millhaven, because it was the thing most entirely her own. My name is May Callum. I came from Dayton, Ohio. I'm on my way to Iron Star Ranch. Something moved in his eyes, fast, controlled, gone before she could name it. Iron Star. His voice stayed level in the practiced way of someone applying deliberate effort. That's what I said. She looked at him. He looked at her. Outside the window, the creek ran on. I have a letter from someone at that ranch. He was supposed to meet me at the Millhaven station yesterday. He didn't come. The silence had a density to it. I'm sorry to hear that, he said. I know. So am I. She stood, went to the supply shelf. 2 biscuits in her coat pocket. She'd put them there at the Dayton station 4 days ago as traveling food and had forgotten them in everything that had followed. She took them out now, looked at them, identical, or close enough, broke the one that was marginally larger in half, then considered and broke it again, making the bigger half bigger. She carried the larger portion across the cabin and set it in the hand lying flat on the blanket. He'd been watching her through half-closed eyes. She'd felt the quality of attention even before she's turned around. His eyes opened fully now, looked at the biscuit, looked at her eat, she said. You need it more than I do right now. She returned to the fire, sat down cross-legged on the floor, and began eating her own portion slowly. The biscuit was dry and slightly stale. It tasted like her mother's kitchen on a Tuesday. Plain, sustaining, not what you'd choose if you had choices, but exactly adequate for what was needed. She ate in small pieces, made each one last. This was not a performance of generosity. She had food and he didn't, and he was injured and she wasn't, and the arithmetic was straightforward. Her mother had understood arithmetic of this kind as a moral position rather than a calculation, and May had inherited the view without ever having to decide whether she agreed with it. She was looking at the fire when he spoke. Your name is May Callum, he said it slowly. The way you say a thing you're storing, yes. And you walked through that pass alone. I did. A pause. Then, with the care of someone picking their way through something, what does the man at Iron Star want with a woman from Dayton, Ohio? She looked at him steadily. He wants a companion who isn't afraid of hard winters or hard work. Those are his words. She looked back at the fire. I answered his advertisement in the Ohio newspaper. He wrote back 3 letters. Then he sent a train ticket. And then he didn't come to the station where he said he'd be. He was quiet long enough that she turned to look at him. He was looking at the biscuit in his hand, not eating it, holding it. His face had the expression of a man who has been handed something he wasn't prepared for and is trying to determine what it is. Then he looked up. What's his name? The man at Iron Star, B. Wade. She watched his face. The station master said everyone knows the name. Said he's the biggest landholder in the Bitterroot. A pause. Do you know him? His eyes moved to the door beam, to the carved letters there. Then back to her, and in that fraction of a second she saw what she was not supposed to see. The look of a man hearing his own name used in a sentence and arriving a beat late to his response. I've heard the name, he said. It's a small valley, May looked at the door beam, looked back at him, let the silence do what it would. Then, what's yours? He looked at her. The wary, assessing look she'd seen a version of since he'd opened his eyes. She watched him decide something, Eli, he said. Just Eli. May held his gaze for a moment longer than comfortable. Then she looked at the fire, the initials above the door, back at the man on the cot who had declined to give her a last name while lying in a cabin that belonged to someone whose last name she already had a reasonable guess about. All right, Eli, she said. You should eat that before it gets any staler. He ate it. She kept her face toward the fire and let him think whatever he needed to think. Outside, the Bitterroot morning was coming fully into itself, cold and clear, the kind of clean that only arrived after weather had done its work. And somewhere between the crackling of the fire and the sound of the creak through the cabin wall, Callum began the quiet process of understanding exactly what she had walked into. She went back for her valise that afternoon. The ankle had disqualified him from comment on the matter, which she appreciated, though she could feel his attention following her to the door and staying there until she returned. The trail back to where she dropped it was straightforward in daylight, shorter than it had felt in the failing light of the previous evening, the way familiar ground always compressed once you knew it. The valise was where she'd left it, wedged between two rocks, the 3 functioning brass fittings intact. Her mother's herb journal was dry inside it. This was the thing she'd been most concerned about, and the relief of finding it undamaged was disproportionate to everything else, which was how she knew the journal was the thing she actually would not have managed losing. She also found, on the return walk, what she hadn't seen the previous evening in the urgency of following the blood trail. The marks of Burns' horse showed clearly now in the soft earth of the upper pass, the normal, even hoof fall of a horse carrying a rider, coming from the north, heading south toward Millhaven. He'd been on the road, he'd been heading toward the station. The rockslide had happened on the way there, not the way back. She filed this away. Did not yet know what to do with it. When she walked back into the cabin, he was sitting up, not lying down, not resting. Sitting against the log wall with his good knee bent and his bad leg stretched out, and his eyes on the door, on the ISR above the door, to be exact, and he was looking at it with the expression of a man conducting an argument with himself about which side was going to win. When she came in, his eyes shifted to her, to the valise. Back to her face, the journal was dry, she said. She set the valise down, took the journal out, held it for a moment in the way she always held it when she picked it up. Not ceremony, just acknowledgement, then set it on the table. You look relieved, he said. I am. She took off her coat, hung it on the hook behind the door. It was my mother's. Some things can be replaced and some can't. She went to the fire. Checked the water level in the pot. How's the head? Better than yesterday. The stitches aren't pulling? No. And the ankle? A shorter pause than the head question warranted. No. She turned to look at him. He looked back with the expression of a man aware he'd answered too quickly. I didn't try to stand, he said, before she could speak. I didn't ask. You were about to. She turned back to the fire. The stool has been moved. A longer silence. I needed to test the range of motion. And then the range of motion confirmed that standing wasn't yet advisable, I see. She kept her voice even because she was keeping it even deliberately, and she was fairly sure he could tell the difference. Next time you want to test something, tell me first. If you've done more damage to the ligaments, I need to know. He said nothing for a moment. Then, fair, she checked the ankle while the water heated, unwrapping the previous poultice, examining the joint, pressing along the bone. The swelling had progressed the way it was going to before it started going the other way, which was normal and expected. The bruising was spreading and deepening, dark purple already mottling toward the edges, no new instability. The ligaments were doing what damaged ligaments did, protecting themselves by making any further use unpleasant enough to discourage it. You'll be off this for at least 3 more days, she said. Possibly 5, depending on how it responds. She began wrapping the joint with fresh strips, which means you're not riding anywhere, which means I'm not walking to Millhaven alone until you're mobile enough to be left. He looked at her. You'd walk 12 miles to Millhaven. Alone, I walked here. I'll figure out the rest when I figure it out. She tied the last strip. Is there anyone at Iron Star who would come looking for you? The pause was 2 beats too long. My foreman, he said. Dutch Alcott. If I haven't come back by tomorrow morning, he'll send someone up the north road. But not through the pass. The pass isn't a road he'd think to check, so we may be here a few days regardless. She stood. Went to the supply shelf. The inventory was enough for 4, maybe 5 days with careful management. That supplies will last. She began setting out what they'd need for a simple supper. Cornmeal, salt, the dried beef. One question, all right? She looked at him directly. At the man who had said his name was Eli, and looked at the initials above the door with the eyes of someone reading his own name. Is there anything else I need to know about this cabin or this valley or this situation that would be useful for me to know before we snowed in together for 5 days? He looked at her. She looked at him. The fire cracked. The creek ran outside. No, he said. And they both knew it was not entirely true, and neither of them said so, and the afternoon settled around them like something that had decided to stay. She made the cornmeal into something edible. He ate what she gave him without comment, which she read as either approval or hunger and suspected was both. The light outside went from gold to amber to the blue-gray of mountain dusk, and she lit the lamp and the cabin contracted to the small warm world the light could reach, and the day became the first in what was shaping up to be several. She would be here for as long as it took. She had not come this far on 47 words to be stopped by a rockslide and a man who hadn't told her his last name. She pulled her mother's journal to her across the table and opened it to the first marked page and began reading by lamplight while the man on the cot, Eli, or whoever he actually was, watched the ceiling and thought about whatever it was that kept his jaw set and his eyes too careful, and his left hand occasionally returning to the silver ring on his right. Outside, the Bitterroot settled into its first full dark of September, cold and enormous and entirely indifferent to the small warm light burning in the outpost cabin beside the creek. May read. He rested. The fire held. For now that was enough. The second morning arrived without the drama of the first. Grey light through the window, then the thin gold that meant the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, then a meadowlark outside. One bird, bright and persistent, apparently convinced that September in Montana was a reasonable time for that kind of optimism. May had slept 4 hours. She knew this not because she'd tracked it, but because the fire had burned to coals when she woke, and she'd built it to last 6, which meant 2 hours were somewhere unaccounted for. Her neck had specific opinions about the floor. She allowed it those opinions and got up anyway. Byrne was already awake. Not recently, the stillness of a man who had been lying in the supposition thinking about something unresolved, which was different from the stillness of rest. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling, both hands flat on the blanket at his sides. The posture of someone trying not to take up more space than they'd been given, which was its own kind of information. For a man that size, how long, May said. Not a question. The opening of an accounting, a while, leg, honest evaluation rather than reflex. Clearer? Good. She went to the fire, got the water heating. I'm going back to the pass this morning. I need to retrieve my bag. She said this without making it into a negotiation, because it wasn't one. He looked at her. Alone, I left it alone. I was occupied at the time. I meant you're going back to the pass alone. I'm aware of what you meant. She was measuring cornmeal into the pot, her back to him. I walked it once already, in failing light with a man twice my weight on a horse. The second time will be shorter and considerably less eventful. The silence from the cot had a specific weight to it. A man running an honest accounting of his position and finding it did not support the argument he wanted to make. The upper section has loose shale, he said. After rain it shifts. It didn't rain last night. Still, Eli, she turned from the fire, looked at him with the level attention she'd been applying to everything since Millhaven. Not hard, not soft, just clear. I walked 12 miles yesterday in shoes made for Ohio. I levered a half-ton granite slab with a pine branch and your horse. I will walk to the pass and back, and I will be here before noon. The thing most likely to slow me down is standing here explaining to you why I'm able to do it. The silence that followed had a different texture. Not resistance. The specific quiet of a man revising an assumption he'd carried in and finding the new version more accurate. There are boots under the cot, he said after a moment. Left there last season. Too big for you, but the soles are thick enough to matter on shale. She looked. He was right. She found a cloth in the supply shelf, wrapped her feet inside the boots until they held, and left. The trail was straightforward in daylight, shorter than it had felt the previous evening. The way ground always compresses once you know it. Her valise was where she'd left it, wedged between 2 rocks, the 3 working brass fittings intact. The herb journal was dry inside. She let herself feel the full relief of that before she picked anything else up and moved on. She also noticed, on the way back, what the failing light of yesterday had obscured. The hoof marks in the soft earth of the upper section told a clear story. A horse coming from the north, heading south toward Millhaven. A rider, a specific destination. The slide had happened on the way there, not the way back. He had been coming to meet her. She held that fact while she walked, turned it over. Did not yet decide what to do with it. She was back before noon. She found him sitting up on the cot, not resting, sitting, with the look of a man who had been arguing with himself in her absence and hadn't reached a verdict he was comfortable with. She set the valise down, took out the journal, held it for a moment in the way she always did, not sentiment, just acknowledgement, and set it on the table. The journal was dry. She said. Something in his face shifted. "You look like that matters more than the bag." "It does." She hung her coat on the hook behind the door. "It was my mother's. The bag I can replace." She sat down at the table, took paper and the small pencil she kept in the valise's inside pocket and began writing. He watched this for a moment from the cot. "What are you writing?" "A letter to the man at Iron Star Ranch." She kept her eyes on the paper. "Since he wasn't able to meet me at the station, I'm informing him that I've found temporary shelter and that I intend to make my way to Crestwood within the week to find lodging and employment while I await his response. I'm asking him to confirm whether he still intends to honor his letter or whether circumstances have changed." She paused. "I'm also asking if he has a foreman named Dutch Alcott who might be sent to collect his horse, which is currently tied behind this cabin eating September grass." The silence from the cot was dense enough to have corners. "You're very practical," he said. "I've had a lot of practice." She kept writing. "If you'd like to add anything, I can include it. Add anything to the letter. If you have a message for anyone at the ranch." She looked up, held his eyes. "Since you seem to know the valley." He looked at her for a long moment. She held the look without blinking. Then she went back to the letter. He said nothing, which was, she noted, also a kind of answer. She sealed the letter and addressed it to B. Wade, Iron Star Ranch, Millhaven County, Montana. Set it on the table. She would find a way to get it sent. There was always a way if you were willing to take the necessary steps. What she did not say, and what she had not yet decided whether to say, was this. She had recognized the initials above the door on the first morning. She had done the arithmetic. A letter addressed to B. Wade, an outpost cabin belonging to Iron Star Ranch. A man in the pass with his horse headed south toward Millhaven on September 14th. The specific day B. Wade had said he would meet her, she was not certain, but she was close enough to certain that it changed how she was listening to everything. She was not angry yet. Anger required confirmation. What she felt instead was the careful, attentive watchfulness of someone who had been given a puzzle they hadn't asked for, and was solving it quietly while they waited for the person holding the remaining pieces to decide to hand them over. She made the cornmeal. She changed his compress. She checked the stitches, holding cleanly, no redness at the margins, and rebandaged the ankle with a fresh yarrow poultice she prepared from what she'd gathered that morning at the creek bank on her way back from the pass. She did all of this with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to every necessary thing. And she did not ask him again what his last name was. She could wait. She was good at waiting when waiting was the useful thing. He watched her work. She'd noticed, a particular quality of attention. Not the watching of someone cataloging or evaluating, but the watching of someone trying to understand how something worked. Like a man who had spent his life with mechanical things and was applying the same focused curiosity to a situation he couldn't take apart with his hands. "Your mother taught you all of it," he said, late in the afternoon. "Not a question. Everything she had time to teach me. She was repacking the medical supplies. She started when I was about 7. She said if she waited until I needed to know it, it would be too late to learn it properly." May set the yarrow bundle to dry near the fire. She was right about most things. What did she get wrong? May considered. She thought I'd stay in Dayton. She said this without bitterness. It was simply the most accurate answer to the question. She thought knowing how to manage in a small world was enough. She didn't account for the possibility that the world she was preparing me for would feel too small once I'd learned how to manage it. He was quiet for a moment. Where does a person go when the world they know gets too small? Apparently Montana. She looked at him. Why did you stay here? In the Bitterroot, something moved in his face. My father's land, he said finally. His father's before that. There's a particular kind of belonging that comes from working the same ground 3 generations. You stop being someone who owns a place and start being part of it. A pause. Or you don't notice the difference till someone asks. It was the most he'd said about himself since she'd found him. She recognized the value of not commenting on that, so she didn't. She was rinsing the copper pot at the creek when she heard the hoofbeats. She heard them before she should have been able to, which meant they were coming from the south on the main trail rather than through the trees. Deliberate, unhurried, the pace of a man who wanted his arrival announced. She straightened up, stood still for a moment with the wet pot in her hands and the creek running cold around her boots. Then she went inside. "There's a rider coming," she said, "from the south, 1 horse." Moving at the pace of official business, Burns sat up. His expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind it rearranged, the way a room rearranges when the heaviest furniture moves. He straightened his shoulders. His right hand went, briefly and without apparent thought, to his hip where a holster would have been before the rockslide took it. He registered the absence and went still. What kind of rider? The kind who was waiting for me at the Millhaven station 2 days ago asking for $15 I don't owe him. A beat. Then, stay close to the door. Don't go outside, I was planning to stand in the doorway. She set the pot down. He can't do anything he hasn't already tried. And you can't walk to the door on that ankle without making it worse, so she looked at him. I'll handle it. His jaw worked. She could read the specific sound of a very large man arriving at the conclusion that someone else had the right of it. Deputy Holt Creech knocked the way people knock when they already know you're home. 3 sharp raps with the knuckle, the kind that said I know you're in there rather than I hope someone's available. May opened the door. He was exactly as she remembered from the station platform. The badge catching the afternoon light, the hat at the deliberate angle of authority, the particular self-assurance of a man accustomed to defining the terms of every situation he walked into. He took her in, then he looked past her into the cabin's interior, at the cot, at the man on it. With the scanning attention of someone taking inventory, Byrne looked back from the cot, unhurried, the way a mountain range regards incoming weather. "Miss Callum?" Creech's voice had acquired a quality of careful pleasantness, like a blade dressed up in cloth. "Word reached me there was a woman sheltering out at this outpost. Wanted to make sure everything was all right. Everything is fine. Thank you for the concern, your friend there. He's hurt? He was injured in the pass. He's recovering." Creech's eyes moved around the cabin again. The organized supplies, the medical materials on the table. The journal open to a page of her mother's handwriting. Byrne, who had not shifted a single inch and was doing something with his stillness that made Creech's eyes return to him twice and then deliberately move away, which told May that whatever Byrne was doing, it was working. "There's still the matter we discussed at the station," Creech said. His voice stayed pleasant. "The residency documentation for women arriving under marriage correspondence. There is no such documentation." She said it the way she said important things, plainly, without heat, without the softening that invited negotiation. "There is no such law in Montana Territory. I know this because I walked to the main road early this morning and stopped a southbound mail rider and sent a letter to the county sheriff's office asking for clarification on the specific statute you cited." Something moved through Creech's face. Fast, controlled, mostly gone. That letter may experience delays. It asked a yes or no question about whether a specific law exists. Either it does or it doesn't. If it does, the response will tell me so. If it doesn't, she left the sentence open. Let him fill it in himself. People always put worse things in those gaps than you would put there, and it saved her the effort. Creech looked past her at Byrne again. Byrne looked back, still nothing moving in his face. Still taking up his portion of the world without apology or announcement. "Funny situation for a woman to find herself in," Creech said, and the pleasantness had thinned enough that the other thing underneath was visible, all the way out here, with a man she doesn't know. At an Iron Star outpost, he looked up at the beam above the door, at the carved initials, with the careful interest of a man remembering something useful. "You know who owns this property? I know it belongs to Iron Star Ranch, which is where I'm headed. As I told you at the station, and you haven't had contact with anyone from that ranch." She felt Byrne's attention from the cot, sharp and still, waiting to see which direction she went. Everything she said next was true. The selection of what to include, that was a different question. "I've had contact with the injured man on that cot, who gave his name as Eli and is in no condition to ride. All true. Exactly as true as it needed to be. I haven't been able to reach Iron Star Ranch because I don't have a horse and he can't ride unassisted." Creech looked at her for a long moment, a man who sensed the outline of something he couldn't quite get purchase on. Then he looked at Byrne with the specific look of someone trying to place a face. Have yourself a safe evening then. The pleasantness was gone entirely now. What replaced it wasn't quite a threat, more the shape of one, the scaffolding. Things in this valley have a way of resolving themselves. One way or another, he remounted. He rode back the way he'd come, taking his time about it, the pace of a man who wanted you to know he wasn't being driven. May closed the door, stood with her hand on the latch. Behind her she heard Byrne's breathing, controlled, deliberate, a man managing something he'd prefer to have handled differently. You sent a letter to the sheriff's office this morning. Not anger in his voice. Something more careful. You were asleep. You walked to the main road alone, an hour each way. The trace is straightforward in daylight. She turned from the door. And before you say what I think you're about to say, that man was going to find me eventually. The longer I waited, the more time he had to establish a version of events where he had standing. The letter means there's a record asking about the law before he had a chance to claim I'd already agreed it applied. The silence lasted long enough that she went back to the table and opened her mother's journal. That man is not safe. His voice, when it came, had something in it she hadn't heard from him before. Not a warning. A statement of established fact, I know. She smoothed the journal's page. That's why I sent the letter before he could stop me. The quality of the quiet that followed was new. She could feel him working through something, not the practical logic of it, which he'd understood immediately, but something underneath, some adjustment to what he understood her to be. She didn't fill the silence. Silence was something most people felt compelled to fix, and the compulsion usually made them say more than they'd planned. You're not what I expected, he said finally. You didn't know to expect me at all. She looked up from the journal. What did you expect? A pause. Careful. I'm not sure I should answer that. Then don't. She looked back at the page. But for what it's worth, I didn't come here with expectations either. I came with 47 words and a train ticket, and so far the most accurate thing those words predicted was the hard winters. She turned the page. The rest remains to be seen. He said nothing. But she felt the shift in his attention. From the careful watchfulness he'd maintained since he opened his eyes in the pass, to something that was still watching but differently. Not assessing. Thinking. She kept reading. He kept thinking. The afternoon moved around them at the pace of things that didn't need to be hurried. The third morning broke clear and stayed that way, the kind of September day that Montana seemed to produce as evidence that it could be generous if it chose, before the long argument of winter. The creek ran bright in the angled light. The aspens on the far bank showed the first yellow at their tips, individual leaves committing early to what the rest of the tree would do in another week. Byrne's color was better. The fever had stayed gone. The stitches on his forehead were holding cleanly. She checked them after breakfast, pressing the skin around the margins with 2 fingers, watching for any heat or redness that would mean the wound was arguing with itself. None. The ankle remained swollen and deeply bruised, but the inflammation hadn't spread in the wrong direction. You could probably sit outside today, she said. For an hour. Not standing, sitting. There's a stump near the door. He looked at the door. At the morning light coming through the window. Something in his face that might have been relief that he kept from being too visible. All right, getting him outside required more coordination than it should have. Given that the distance was 8 feet, and he was the one with working arms and a functioning leg. He was not accustomed, she'd concluded, to asking for help. Not as stubbornness, he'd cooperated with everything she'd told him was necessary. More as a deep habit of sufficiency, the kind built over decades of being the largest person in any situation, and therefore the one least likely to need anything from anyone else. She got him to the stump. He sat. The morning sun came down through the pines and reached them, and he turned his face toward it with the expression of a man who had been cold for 3 days without fully registering it until warmth arrived. She stood a few feet away, letting him have the sun, looking at the creek. You said your mother died when you were 18, he said, not preceded by anything. Just said into the morning like a thought he'd been holding and had decided to release. Yes, what did she die of? Lung disease. The mill work? She looked at the water. 3 months of getting worse, and then one morning she stopped getting worse and stopped entirely. He was quiet. The meadowlark that had taken up residence somewhere in the brush was at it again, its song slightly manic in the cool air. My wife died 3 winters ago, he said. She waited. She didn't look at him. She'd learned that some tellings needed the listener to be present without being visible. Fever. It went fast. 3 days from sick to gone, he paused. The sound of the creek filling the gap. I was out checking the north fence line when she died. The section up near the Caldwell boundary. It had come down and cattle were crossing the neighbor's property. I stayed out to repair it. Didn't get back until after dark. His voice didn't change in pitch or speed, but something in the quality of it altered, the way the texture of wood changes after water gets into it. She was already gone when I came in. May looked at the water. I was 2 hours later than I would have been, he said. If the fence had held, 2 hours wouldn't have changed what the fever did. I know, he said it. The way people say they know things they haven't finished knowing. People told me that. The doctor told me that. I told myself that. A pause. Knowing doesn't always reach far enough to be useful. She turned to look at him now. He was looking at the creek, his hands loose on his knees, the silver ring on his right hand catching a piece of the morning light. What was her name? May said. Margaret. What was she like? He looked over at her. The question had reached him somewhere he hadn't expected. What do you mean? I mean, what was she like? As a person, May looked back at the water. People always say how someone died. They don't usually say how they lived. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, she had no patience for inefficiency. None at all. If something could be done in 5 steps, she wanted to know why anyone was using 6. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. She also had no ability to function in the morning. 0. Walked into the kitchen doorframe 3 mornings in a row the week we moved into the main house. Couldn't find her shoes any day of the week, regardless of where she'd put them. Took 2 cups of coffee to achieve basic competency. The shift at the corner of his mouth became something more definite. She thought all of it was funnier than I did, and he laughed. It came out before he could decide whether to allow it. Short and genuine and rough-edged, the laugh of a man who hadn't expected the sound to still be in him. May looked at him while he laughed. She saw him arrive at it, and then she saw what it left behind when it subsided. Not grief returning, but something that had lived underneath the grief, still intact. The actual memory, warm, specific, belonging to no one else. She sounds like someone worth knowing, May said. The laughter settled. He looked at the creek again. She was. He turned the ring on his finger once, a small unconscious motion. She would have asked you 14 questions by now. She did that with everyone. Said the only way to know a person was to ask them things until they told you something they hadn't planned on. She'd have been disappointed in me then. I don't answer until I'm asked. She'd have admired that. She had no patience for people who talk to fill space. He looked at May. Said information you hadn't earned wasn't information you could trust. May considered this. She was right. She usually was. He looked away. The ring again, turning once. That was one of the inconvenient things about her. They sat in the morning sun in a silence that had changed in the past 10 minutes. Thinner now, less defended. The silence of 2 people who have moved a few feet closer together without physically moving at all. May thought about what she'd found in the past that morning. The hoof marks going south, the direction of a man heading toward Millhaven on September 14th. She thought about the ISR above the door. She thought, he will tell me when he tells me. She didn't push. She looked at the creek and listened to the meadowlark and let the morning be what it was. The 4th day, May was at the table with the herb journal open when she felt rather than heard him get up. The particular shift in the cabin's weight, the uneven sound of careful footsteps. 1 foot, then a lighter placement of the other. She looked up. He was standing in the middle of the cabin, upright, unassisted. His face held the concentrated expression of someone doing arithmetic. Your assessment, she said. Functional. He took a step, controlled, the bad ankle taking partial weight, the rest compensating. Not comfortable. Functional is what we're going for today. She closed the journal. Sit down before you've proven the point and your body starts making its own decisions about how long you stay up. He sat. But he sat in the chair at the table instead of going back to the cot, which was its own kind of progress. He looked at the journal. At the page she'd had open, her mother's careful drawing of a yarrow plant, labeled in the small tight script that May had been reading since she was old enough to read anything. Teach me, he said. She looked at him. The plants. He nodded at the journal. What you used on the ankle, what you used on the head wound. I live alone on 40,000 acres of mountain land. The nearest doctor is 3 hours away in good weather, longer in snow. He met her eyes directly. No apology in the request, no performance of humility. Just the straightforward accounting of a man who had identified a gap in what he knew and intended to close it. You saved my life with that knowledge. It seems worth learning. She looked at him for a moment. Then she turned the journal so he could see the page. Pay attention, she said. I don't repeat myself. He paid attention. She taught the way her mother had taught her, which was not by list or catalogue but by story, because her mother had understood that the mind holds narrative where it loses inventory. Every plant had a story attached to it, where it grew, how to recognize it, what it was for, and underneath the practical information ran the current of all the times her mother had used it, all the people it had helped or failed to help, all the specific details that made knowledge stick. Yarrow. She pulled the journal toward her, tapped the illustration. It grows near water, usually within 30 feet of a reliable source. The white flower heads are flat, not domed like chamomile, flat, like a table someone set carefully. The smell when you crush the leaves is sharp, medicinal. You'll know it. She looked up. What does your ankle feel like right now compared to yesterday morning, he considered. Less like something's on fire. More like something's been recently on fire. That's the yarrow. It reduces the inflammation. It doesn't fix the damage. Nothing does that except time. But it makes the conditions better for the healing that has to happen on its own. She turned the page. My mother used it the winter I was 12. There was influenza in the mill district that season. 6 weeks of it moving through the boarding houses. She couldn't afford to get sick. Missing work wasn't survivable. So every evening she made yarrow tea and made me drink it too. May ran her finger along the edge of the illustration. I asked her once why she bothered when the neighbors weren't doing it. She said you couldn't know which things would work until you'd tried them consistently for long enough. Said the only way to be certain a prevention hadn't worked was to have not tried it and gotten sick anyway. He was watching her hands. Did it work? We didn't get sick that winter. She looked up, which could mean the yarrow worked, or could mean we were lucky. She said it didn't matter. The habit was worth keeping either way. She moved on. Mugwort, its silvery green leaves soft to the touch, its smell bitter and specific, useful for wound poultices. She talked about where to find it. It preferred disturbed ground, edges of trails, places where the soil had been opened up. She talked about the winter her mother had used it on a burn that the landlord's son had gotten from a stove. How she'd made the paste and applied it twice a day for 10 days, and the wound had healed without the scarring. The doctor later said he would have expected. Byrne listened. Not the way most people listened, with half their attention already on their response. He listened with all of it, asking questions that proved he'd absorbed the previous answer before moving on. How do you remember which is which? He said. When you're out in the field, away from the book, you learn to look for where things live. She stood, went to the door, opened it to the morning without going outside, pointing out through the gap. Yarrow near the water, mugwort on the trail edges. The distinction isn't just the plant, it's the whole context around it. After a while you stop looking for the plant and start reading the landscape it lives in. The plant is almost the last thing you confirm. He turned that over. Same as tracking. You stop looking for the animal and start reading what the land is doing around where the animal was. Exactly, she looked at him. Your mother teach you that? My father. Something shifted in his face. Not loss. Something more settled than loss. The expression of grief that has been lived with long enough to become simply part of the view. He died when I was 22. Heart. But before that he spent 16 years taking me out into the Bitterroot and showing me how to read it. He paused. He said the mountain would tell you everything you needed to know if you learned to ask it the right questions. My mother said almost the same thing about plants. May closed the journal. She said each one was a sentence in a language. And once you knew enough of the vocabulary, you started reading whole paragraphs. He looked at her. Where did you learn to say things like that? From her. She talked that way about everything. May set the journal on the shelf above the table. It used to embarrass me when I was young. I wanted her to talk like everyone else. Later I understood it was how she made sense of a world that didn't give her much to work with. You make meaning with what you have. He was quiet for a moment. The fire settled. Outside the creek ran its constant commentary. Come outside, he said. Show me where the yarrow grows, your ankle. We'll hold for 30 minutes of slow walking on flat ground. He looked at her with the direct patience of someone who had evaluated the question and reached a conclusion. I've been horizontal for 4 days. I need to move and I need to learn something real. Show me in the actual ground, not the book. She looked at him. Then she handed him the walking stick he'd cut and shaped on the 3rd morning, a piece of pine, straight-grained, stripped of its bark, and opened the door. They went to the creek bank. He moved with the deliberate economy of a man managing pain by not acknowledging it out loud, the stick taking some of the ankle's work. She walked at his pace without making it visible that she was adjusting to him. The yarrow grew in thick clusters within 20 feet of the water, exactly where she'd told him it would. She crouched beside a clump. Let him look first. White flowers, he said, flat, and the leaves. She separated one stem from the cluster, held it up. See how they're divided, feathery almost, and the underside is paler than the top. She held it toward him. He took it, turned it over. Crush a small piece between your fingers, he did. Held his fingers to his nose. His expression acknowledged the smell without performing a reaction to it. That's the confirmation, she said. If the visual matches and the smell matches, you have it. What's the look-alike? There are a few plants with white flowers that could confuse you at a glance. None of them smell like this when crushed, she stood. The smell is the test you can't fake. They moved along the bank. She showed him mugwort, dark and silver-green against the creek stones, the soft undersides of its leaves. She showed him dock, broad-leafed, growing close to where the water touched the bank. She told him about the look-alike that grew in drier ground further from the water. Similar leaf shape, different texture, stomach cramps as the consequence of confusing them. How did you learn the hard things? He said. The ones where getting it wrong had consequences. I made mistakes. She looked at the water, small ones when I was young, because she introduced me to the easy distinctions first and only gave me access to the dangerous ones when I'd proven I could hold the easier knowledge without getting careless. She crouched beside a dock plant, turned a leaf over. She said carelessness in this kind of learning was usually the result of being taught too fast. That understanding needed time to settle before you added the next layer. He was standing slightly behind and to her left, leaning on the walking stick. She could feel him considering something. You talk about her a great deal, he said. Not as a criticism. As an observation, she taught me everything that's kept me alive and functional. May stood. I don't talk about her. I just repeat what she said. Because most of it was right. She looked over at him. He was looking at her with the expression she'd noticed first on the 2nd morning. Not evaluating, not assessing, trying to understand how something worked. But the expression was different now than it had been then. Less careful, more open. Something was happening in the architecture of his face that hadn't been happening before the morning by the creek, before the story about Margaret, and she was trying to decide whether she'd caused it or simply noticed it. Your turn, she said. He blinked. Beg your pardon, you said your father taught you to read the land. Show me something I don't know about this particular patch of it. She gestured at the creek, the tree line, the sky above them. We've been going one direction for 4 days. What can you tell me about this place that a journal couldn't? He was quiet for a moment. Then he turned to look at the far bank. The water level is down about 3 inches from where it was when we got here, he said. Which means the source, probably a spring somewhere uphill of us, northeast, slowed down in the past 4 days. That usually means a dry week is coming. When the source reduces that fast, the snowpack above it isn't releasing as much water. No snowpack release means the temperature at elevation has dropped. Cold coming, he looked at the sky. The light today is different from yesterday, flatter. You don't see shadows under the pines the same way. That's what the sky does when weather is building at a distance. May looked at where he was looking. How much time? Day and a half. Maybe 2. She looked at the clouds to the west. Ordinary looking to her eye, nothing she'd have flagged as significant. What should we do before it arrives? Extra wood inside. Check the roof for gaps. He glanced at the cabin. The north side hasn't been inspected since summer. There's usually at least one place where the chinking has dried and cracked. He paused. And we should stay close to shelter once the front moves through. Mountain storms in September can drop 10 degrees in an hour. She filed all of this. Show me how to check the chinking. He showed her. They worked along the north wall of the cabin. Her hands doing most of it, him directing. identifying the places where the mortar between logs had shrunk and cracked over the summer. She packed the gaps with the clay mud from the creek bank, pressing it in with her fingers, smoothing it flat. He showed her how to test whether the repair would hold, pressing a piece of bark against the fresh clay and checking the seal. They were at the far corner of the north wall, the last gap sealed, when she reached up to the highest point, stretching further than comfortable, and his hand came to her shoulder, briefly, without announcement, steadying her without making it into anything more than steadiness. She sealed the last gap, stepped back. His hand had already moved. They were both looking at the wall. "Good," he said. "Good," she agreed. They went back inside and did not discuss it. The storm arrived exactly when he'd said it would. 1 hour of warning first. The birds went quiet. The temperature dropped enough to notice without a thermometer. The light flattened to something that made the pines look like cutouts against the sky. May had the extra wood stacked inside by then, the water pot filled and hung, the supplies moved away from the north wall. She'd done these things without being asked, reading the preparations off his earlier instructions and working through them, while he sat at the table checking her repair work on the chinking and directing small corrections. Then the sky closed, not gradually. Montana storms didn't negotiate their arrival. One moment the evening was simply cold, and the next the first drops came in horizontally, driven by a wind that had apparently been saving itself, and then the full weight of it arrived, and the cabin went from shelter to fortress in the space of 30 seconds. The north wall held, the chinking held. One spot on the roof, the section above the cot, where the logs had been laid at a slightly different angle than the rest, let in a thin stream of water that she caught with the copper pot repositioned from the hearth. She moved the supplies again, shifted the blankets, worked around the leak with the practicality of someone who'd lived in rooms where rain found the ceiling gaps on a regular basis. Byrne moved too, pulling things toward the drier sections, stacking what could be stacked, directing her attention to one corner while he managed another. He moved through the small space with a precision she hadn't expected. For a man his size, in a room this size, he had developed obvious long habit of knowing exactly where his elbows were. By midnight the storm was at its full height. Wind rattling the door in its frame, rain hammering the roof with a noise like something trying to communicate urgency. The fire was keeping the core of the cabin livable, but the edges were cold, the temperature having dropped more than 10 degrees since the front arrived. The driest section was the corner near the hearth. May spread both blankets there. He brought one from the cot. She'd been using the other near the fire, and they settled in the way that people settle when the available options have reduced to one. Side by side, backs against the warm logs of the chimney wall, the fire's heat reaching them at an angle, close, not touching. The specific distance of two people respecting the line while acknowledging that the line had moved. The lamp had been put out to save the oil. The only light was the fire, which threw the room in moving orange and shadow. "The woman at the station," May said. She wasn't looking at him, she was watching the fire. The one trying to take $15 from women who'd just arrived. Creech. He's been doing this a while. Probably. His voice was low, controlled for the close quarters. A deputy with that kind of operation doesn't build it overnight. He'd need to know which trains came in, when, what women would be on them and why. He'd need someone at the station to let him know. A pause. The station master, I thought so, she had thought so. The station master's expression when she'd declined to wait for the Thursday train had contained something she hadn't been able to name at the time. Now she could. He profits from women who are frightened enough to pay and then too ashamed of being deceived to report it. Yes. And women who are alone and just arrived and don't know the territory are the easiest targets. Yes. She looked at the fire. I wasn't frightened, I was annoyed. Something moved in his voice. I noticed that about you. A pause. You don't read as frightened even when the situation warrants it. I've been frightened. She moved the blanket slightly. I just decided a long time ago that frightened wasn't useful information to give to people who were trying to use it against you. He was quiet for a moment. Then, that sounds like a decision made after something specific. The landlord where we lived after my mother died. He raised the rent the week after her funeral because he'd seen me cry at the service. She said this without drama, the way you describe something that happened long enough ago to have become simply fact. I paid the increase that month. The next month I found a different room. Byrne said nothing. She could feel him holding what she'd said with a care that she'd noticed he applied to most things. He didn't respond to information he wasn't sure what to do with yet, which was a habit she respected because it was one she shared. "Margaret," he started. "You don't have to, I know." He paused. "I want to." Another pause, shorter. She was afraid of one thing, just one. She was a practical woman, not much rattled her, but she was afraid of being forgotten. Not of dying, she wasn't particularly afraid of that. Of being forgotten afterward, of the specific texture of who she was going away with no record. May looked at the fire, said nothing. Let him continue when he was ready. "I kept her things for 2 years. Her shoes under the bed, her coffee cup on its specific peg." He turned the ring on his right hand once slowly. "Dutch told me eventually that I was keeping them for myself, not for her. That she was already somewhere, the shoes didn't matter." He paused. He was right. He's right about most things. "What did you do?" "Gave the shoes to Mrs. Macy for the church donation. Put the cup in the kitchen with the others." He was quiet for a moment. "It didn't make her more forgotten. It just meant I had to sit with what I'd been avoiding sitting with, which was that I didn't know what came next." He said this with the directness of someone who had arrived at a truth through long work and was no longer afraid to say it plainly. 44 years of knowing what the next day was going to look like. "And then I didn't." May turned to look at him. He was looking at the fire. His face in the firelight was less guarded than she'd seen it. Not unguarded, not open, but the guard had shifted, the way a door shifts when the latch isn't fully engaged. "Is that why you placed the advertisement?" she said. Eventually, he looked at her. "Not at first. At first I placed it because Dutch suggested it, and I didn't have a reason compelling enough to argue against it. And I've learned over the years that when Dutch makes a suggestion I don't have a strong case against, he's usually seen something I haven't." He paused. "But I got 43 letters before yours. And after the first 20 I understood what I was actually looking for, which was what I hadn't been able to name before." "And what was that?" He looked at the fire again. She felt him deciding how much to say, how precisely to say it. "Someone I'd be glad to know," he said. "Not someone to fill a function. Someone I'd actually be glad." The wind hit the door hard enough to move it in the frame. Both of them looked. The fire surged in the draft and the light jumped and settled. The moment had been interrupted before he said the next thing. She felt the interruption as a physical event, a space where something had been about to land, now emptied. She turned back to the fire. "You should sleep. The ankle is going to be worse tomorrow if you don't." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read in the moving firelight. Then he settled back against the chimney wall. "May," he said, quietly into the noise of the storm. "Yes, I'm going to tell you something tomorrow." He said it, with the care of someone making a commitment they intend to keep. "Something I should have told you on the first morning." She looked at him. His face was serious. The expression of a man who has finished an internal argument and finally reached the side he knew was right. "All right," she said. She kept her voice even, gave nothing away, because she already knew what he was going to tell her, and had known since the second morning, and had been waiting for him to get there in his own time, which was, she had concluded, the only time that mattered. She fell asleep sometime after the storm peaked, which she would not have predicted given the noise and the cold and the quality of the floor. But exhaustion had its own arithmetic, and after 5 nights of partial sleep her body finally collected what it was owed. She woke in the deep middle of the night. The storm had pulled back, not ended, but retreated to something that rumbled at a distance rather than pressing directly against the walls. The fire was lower, the cabin in the particular darkness of a place with no artificial light once the fire burned small. She was warm enough. The blankets had been arranged, at some point she hadn't registered, so that they covered her more fully than they'd been when she'd settled. She lay still. Listening. Byrne was not asleep. She could tell by the quality of his breathing, present and deliberate, a man awake and managing the fact of being awake rather than drifting toward rest. She'd learned the difference over the past 5 nights without trying to, the way you learn things that you hear consistently, underneath the breathing, barely at the threshold of hearing words. Not to her, not to anyone present. To something he was working out alone in the way that men like him apparently worked things out. In the dark, quietly, when they believed nobody was listening, she strained without moving. Caught shapes, should have told her, a pause. First morning, should have just. The fire shifted. A log settling, one coal into another, a sound that covered the next few words. She doesn't know. His voice dropped lower. A sound like something being placed down with great care. And when she does, she'll... He didn't finish. Or he did finish, but somewhere below what she could reach, May lay still. Eyes nearly closed, heart doing something in her chest that she had no tidy category for. She knew. She had known since the second morning, the initials, the horse, the hoof marks in the pass going south on September 14th, the way he'd looked when she'd said Iron Star Ranch with the careful blankness of a man hearing his own name used by someone else and needing a beat to construct his response. She'd said nothing. She'd been watching. Waiting to see how he held what she'd given him, and what he'd done, she thought. Lying still in the dark and listening to him wrestle with whatever he was wrestling with was hold it carefully. He hadn't banked it. He hadn't used it. He'd carried it like something he was trying to figure out how to return. She thought about 47 words, about what kind of man wrote them and meant them, and then panicked when given the chance to be known in person. Not a dishonest man, a frightened one. There was a difference, and the difference mattered. She thought about Margaret and the shoes kept under the bed for 2 years, about what it cost a person to open up something that had been sealed shut and examine what was inside. She thought about 43 letters and one that was different. Eventually his breathing changed, deepened, evened out into the rhythms of genuine sleep finally. May opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling, at the shadows the dying fire threw across the log beams, and felt the full weight of the situation without managing it, which was what she usually did with weight. She gave herself until the fire went to coals. Then she would sleep, and in the morning he would tell her what he'd decided to tell her, and she would decide how to respond to what she'd actually known for days. That was the only honest way through. She slept. Dawn came cold and washed clean, the way dawn came after mountain storms. The air clarified by what had moved through it, the sky a hard thin blue, the creek running higher from the rain and louder for it. Byrne was standing at the door when she woke. He'd opened it to the morning, cold coming in, and the smell of wet pine and stone, and the particular silence of a landscape that has been scoured and is waiting to see what fills it. He heard her move. "Didn't turn around, we need to leave today," he said. She sat up. Every muscle in her back registered the accumulated opinion of 5 nights on a plank floor. "The ankle is better than yesterday," he turned. His face was clear in a way it hadn't been before, the expression of a man who has finished something internal and arrived at the side he intended to act from. "There's somewhere I need to take you." "Where?" The pause that followed was the last one of its kind, though she didn't know that yet. He looked at her with the eyes of a man who has carried something too long and has made the decision to put it down. "Trust me," he said. "Can you do that?" May looked at him, thought about the dark hours and what she'd heard, thought about 47 words and the hoof marks in the pass, thought about a man who'd laughed at a memory he'd been afraid to touch and found it still warm. "Yes," she said. "I reckon I can." Something crossed his face. The beginning of something. Not quite relief, not yet. The first breath of it. The loosening that comes when you stop holding something you've been holding alone for too long. Good. He looked out the door, at the cold bright morning. "Get your bag. We leave when you're ready." She was ready in 10 minutes. She always had been. They rode out as the last of the storm's cold was lifting, the black horse carrying both of them north through a world the rain had pressed flat and then released. The grasses standing again, the creek running loud with everything it had collected overnight, the peaks to the north sharp-edged against a sky that had decided, after considerable argument, to be clear. May sat in front, Byrne behind her, his arm around her waist for the practical reason that the trail was uneven and she had no stirrups, and someone needed to ensure she didn't go sideways on the switchbacks that climbed out of the canyon section. That was the complete accounting of it. She applied this accounting carefully and found it accurate and also found it insufficient, because the warmth that came off him through her coat and through the back of her dress reached her in ways that practical accounting did not fully address. She looked at the aspens on the far bank of the creek they were following. Yellow now, fully committed, the individual leaves trembling in the thin morning wind with the specific motion of things that know their season is particular and intend to use all of it. He started talking after 20 minutes. Not the way he'd talked in the cabin, in pieces extracted carefully, each word weighed before it was released. He talked the way water moves when you remove what was holding it back. Her name was Sylvia Crane, not the name of someone he'd loved, the name of a storm he'd survived and had been living in the shadow of since. She answered the advertisement I placed in the fall of '85. 3 letters, careful, specific, nothing that sounded performed. She arrived on the November stage and she was exactly what she'd described. Clear-eyed, practical. Didn't try to be more than she said she was. May said nothing. The horse's gait was steady beneath them, covering familiar ground. 6 weeks after the ceremony she was gone. $3,000 from the locked box in my office, my best mare. A saddlebag I'd had since I was 20. He paused, the sound of the creak filling the gap between sentences. Turned out she'd done it before. Different name each time, different territory. The federal marshal's office had a file on her. Sent me a letter 3 weeks after she'd gone, which was when letters arrived when you would have traded most of what you owned to have had them 2 months earlier. He stopped talking. The trail climbed out of the canyon section and the grassland opened ahead of them, the valley floor stretching north in long, slow waves of gold and pale green, the mountains above it carrying the season's first snow at the peaks. May breathed in through her nose. Let it out. She had seen grassland before. Ohio had fields. But this was not a field. This was something that made fields seem like arguments for a different principle entirely. The principle that land should be contained, understandable, scaled to what a person could take in from a single vantage. What was in front of her operated on different logic. It went on until the mountains caught it, and then the mountains went on. She said nothing. He gave her the silence to take it in. After that I decided I was done. His voice when it resumed was level, not flat, level, the tone of something that has been examined and set into its proper place. No more advertisements, no more strangers. The ranch was enough, the work was enough. Dutch didn't argue. He has the particular quality of knowing when an argument isn't what's needed. But you placed another one, May said. I placed another one. He said this with the plain acknowledgement of a man who had lost an argument with himself and was honest about it. 8 months after I put the notice in the paper, the first responses started coming. I got 43 letters before yours. Most of them I could read through the first paragraph. Not badly, most of those women wanted something real. But I could see the calculation, the specific hope underneath the words, and how that hope was organized. The trail opened onto a long, flat stretch. The horse moved into a longer stride. Yours had no calculation, he said. You wrote about your mother's handwriting in an herb journal. You wrote that you were competent at necessary things and uninteresting at most everything else, which is a sentence nobody writes if they're trying to make an impression. You wrote that you expected nothing beyond a fair chance. He paused. I read it 4 times. Then I wrote back. May looked at the mountains. At the way the snow caught the morning light at the peaks and held it while everything below was still in the blue shadow of the early hour. So you came to meet me, she said. I left Iron Star on the 12th. He shifted slightly behind her. I wanted 2 days of riding rather than 1. The Bitterroot weather in September can close a pass overnight, and I didn't want to be caught on the wrong side of a front and arrive late. So I planned to stop at the Caldwell boundary line overnight, rest the horse, and come into Millhaven the morning of the 14th with time to spare. He paused. My horse stepped wrong on a loose section of shale in the upper pass on the 13th. She went down. I went off. The slide came before I could get clear. He stopped. The open land stretched before them, fence lines appearing now on the horizon, the smudge of buildings further north. When I woke up and you were there, and you didn't know my name, and you were looking at me the way you look at a problem that needs solving rather than a person whose name you needed to know. I made a decision I cannot defend. You decided to stay unknown, yes, because you wanted to see what I was without the weight of what you are. Yes, he said it the same way he'd said it in the cabin the night before, owning it, without softening it, without adding an apology that would cost him nothing and change nothing. It was wrong. I knew that while I was doing it, I did it anyway, because being wrong about someone once had gotten into me in a way I hadn't finished working out. And the chance to watch you operate without the ranch or the money or the name in the conversation was. He paused. I told myself it was information I needed. It was fear dressed up as information. May looked at the valley spread in front of them, at the fence lines in the distance, running straight and far, at the smudge of buildings on the northern horizon that she'd been watching grow for the past hour. Were the letters real, she said. The 47 words, he straightened behind her. The full height of a man pulling himself to what he actually was. Everyone, then that's the only reason, she said, that I'm still on this horse with you. He had no answer for that. She hadn't expected one. She turned to look at the buildings ahead, which were no longer a smudge. They had resolved into shapes now, distinct structures spreading across the land with the organized logic of a place built by someone who thought about permanence, she thought. So this is it? And then? Of course it is, and then, without deciding to think it. He prepared a room, for me, for the person who answered his letter, and somewhere in those buildings that room exists, and I'm about to see what a man who writes 47 plain words thinks a woman might want. She held that thought for the rest of the ride, and underneath it, quieter, the one she didn't examine too directly yet. He had been on the road, he had already been coming. The buildings grew from shapes into specifics over the last 20 minutes of riding. What she'd taken from a distance for a main house was that, but larger than she'd expected and set back from the work structures, with the deliberateness of someone who understood that a house was a different thing from a barn or a bunkhouse and should be positioned to communicate that difference. 2 stories. A wraparound porch, windows on the upper floor facing east, a kitchen garden to the south, well maintained, the last of the summer vegetables still standing. She noted all of this, filed it. The gate was iron, substantial posts sunk deep, a crossbar overhead, and worked into the crossbar's center a 5-pointed star, the same shape as the 3 letters above the cabin door made solid and dimensional. It was not decorative in the way of something put up to impress. It was declarative. This is what this place is. This has a name. Dutch Alcott came out of the barn at the sound of the horse. Running, or the version of running that 65 years on horseback permits. A fast, rolling, bow-legged movement that covered ground efficiently despite not looking like it should. He was shouting before he was close enough for the words to resolve. Then they resolved, burn. Lord Almighty, we found your hat in the pass, and the blood on the rocks, and the horse gone, and we thought. He stopped, 4 feet away, looking up at the man on the horse, with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing bad news for 6 days, and is genuinely unprepared for the alternative. His eyes were wet. He didn't do anything to manage it. We thought you were dead. I'm not dead. Byrne's voice carried something it hadn't carried in the cabin. A register she hadn't heard before, a specific gravity that came not from effort but from years of being the person others organized around. He said it plainly, without performance. May Callum found me in the pass. She kept me alive, he paused. If you'd been in the same situation with the same injuries, you'd have died. Dutch looked at May. A fast, comprehensive assessment, the kind built over decades of evaluating people under working conditions, reading the difference between someone who understood hard circumstances and someone who'd simply survived one. Whatever he found, it passed whatever standard he was applying. Something in his face settled from assessment into something warmer, ma'am. He took his hat off, held it to his chest. I believe I know who you are. Then you know more than I did when I arrived, May said. Dutch blinked, looked at Byrne, looked back at May, put his hat on, a man filing information efficiently and moving on. Mrs. Ruth Macy appeared on the porch steps, a solid woman in her late 50s, iron-gray hair pulled back without fuss, the unhurried bearing of someone who had been managing a large household for long enough that nothing surprised her, and most things merely required direction. She came down the steps with the same efficiency, looked at Byrne, looked at his forehead, at the stitches May had placed, visible above the healing edges of the wound. Looked at May. Come inside, she said. To both of them, but she looked at May when she said it. Dutch pulled Byrne aside while May was helping Mrs. Macy with the door. She didn't hear everything, didn't try to, but she caught enough. Dutch's voice low and direct. Creech had been at the ranch the previous morning, asking Mrs. Macy questions about the property boundaries and whether there was any outstanding legal uncertainty about Iron Star's title, while Byrne was unaccounted for. He'd cited something about intestate complications on properties with pending marriage correspondence. Mrs. Macy had told him to get off the property. He'd gone. But he'd left knowing 2 things. That Byrne had been expected at Millhaven on the 14th to meet a woman who'd answered his advertisement, and that a week of unexplained absence had created the kind of legal ambiguity that a man with forged documents and a cooperative notary might find useful. May absorbed this while she helped with the door latch. So, Not impulsive then. He'd been building towards something before she'd even arrived at the ranch. The station approach had been the opening, not the whole plan. It was while May was helping Byrne through the gate, his hand on her shoulder for the uneven ground. More habit than necessity now, the ankle having graduated from impossible to manageable, that she heard the second set of hoofbeats, 3 horses coming from the south on the main road, moving at the deliberate pace of an official arrival. Something went still in her chest. Not fear, the other thing, the cold attention that came when a situation required managing. She looked at Dutch. His face had changed. Deputy Holt Creech came through the gate with 2 men behind him, neither in uniform, both positioned in the specific way of men present for emphasis rather than function. Creech wore his badge and his careful hat, and the expression of a man who had timed this arrival and was pleased with the timing. Beside him rode a woman May had never seen, mid-30s, dressed in the considered way of someone who had been told what well-dressed looked like, and had assembled the components from that description rather than from experience with the thing itself. She held a folded document in both hands. Her hands were not steady. May looked at the document, looked at Creech, looked at the woman, thought, and then, so this is what he built while Byrne was missing. The station approach was the opener. This was the play he'd been preparing if the opener failed. Creech drew up near the main house porch. Byrne had stopped walking. He stood in the yard, still present, taking up his portion of the world without announcement, and watched Creech with the expression she'd seen him use for things that required management. Mr. Wade. Creech's voice had the formal quality of someone performing official business in front of witnesses he'd arranged to have present. The hands who'd come out of the buckhouse at the sound of horses. Mrs. Macy on the porch steps. Dutch at the gate. The young rider who'd come in from the eastern pasture and hadn't quite made it back out. He'd timed it for exactly this. A full audience. There's a legal matter requiring your attention, Creech continued. This woman, he indicated the woman beside him, is here to present documentation relevant to a claim against the Iron Star property. Specifically, a claim of legal marriage to Bernard Wade. Performed in Billings in March of 1885, never formally dissolved. Establishing an interest in the property and its assets, the yard went quiet in the way yards go quiet when something significant is happening that nobody wants to interrupt. The woman stepped forward. Her rehearsed voice came out a beat too level, the sound of words recited rather than said. My name is Violet Sumner. I have documentation of a legal marriage to Bernard Wade. May I see that document? May said it clearly into the silence, before she'd consciously decided to step forward. Before she'd decided anything, actually. Her feet had moved on the same instinct that had moved them in the past toward the hand jutting from under the granite slab. Someone needed to. She was there. That was sufficient. She was standing in the center of the yard. Creech turned to look at her. The calculating look of a man reassessing a board he thought he'd set. Miss Callum, her name in his mouth, like something he was testing for structural integrity. This is a legal proceeding that isn't a proceeding of any kind until someone reviews the documentation. She held her hand out toward Violet Sumner. Not toward Creech, toward the woman holding the paper. She looked at her directly, not at the badge, not at the hat, at the woman's face, where the uncertainty was visible to anyone paying attention. May I? Violet Sumner looked at Creech. Creech said nothing. The woman looked back at May, and something in May's expression, the absolute, unhurried absence of any expectation except that she would be handed the document, made the woman hand it over. May unfolded it. Read it the way she read everything that mattered. Not skimming, not performing reading, actually reading, line by line, letting each sentence land before moving to the next. March 1885. Billings, Montana Territory. A ceremony performed by a minister named Harold Lowe, now apparently deceased. A notary seal in the lower right corner. The name of the notary stamped in the seal's center, Joseph Craddock. She held the document for a moment. Let the name settle into its proper place alongside the other things she knew. She had read that name 6 days ago, in the Iron Star outpost cabin, in a piece of correspondence filed in the wrong box, the supply inventory rather than the correspondence box, an error she'd corrected on the second morning while organizing the cabin. The letter was from the Federal Marshal's District Office, addressed to B. Wade, dated 6 months prior. It informed him that one Joseph Craddock, notary formerly operating in Billings and 3 surrounding counties, had been arrested on charges of document forgery across multiple jurisdictions, and was currently held at the Billings County jailhouse awaiting trial. She had read it, filed it correctly, and moved on to the next item in the stack. She had not mentioned it to Byrne because at the time it hadn't seemed connected to anything immediate. Now it was the most connected thing she knew. She looked up from the document. The yard was watching her. All of it. The hands, Mrs. Macy, Dutch, the young rider. Creech, with the specific expression of a man who has realized something, has gone wrong but hasn't yet identified exactly where. This seal was made by a man named Joseph Craddock. She said it without heat, without theater. Information presented plainly, who has been in the Billings County jailhouse since March of this year, charged with the identical crime he committed to produce this document. Forging legal seals, she looked at Creech. I know this because Iron Star Ranch received a letter from the Federal Marshal's District Office 6 months ago informing Mr. Wade of the arrest. I read that letter on my second day at the outpost cabin, while I was organizing the correspondence files. The letter was misfiled in the supply inventory. I corrected the filing and read everything in the stack. The silence in the yard had gone from the silence of an audience to the silence of something being processed. Furthermore, May continued, because she had started and she was going to finish, this document is dated March of 1885. Specifically, March 9th through March 11th, the dates listed for the ceremony and filing. Iron Star Ranch's foreman keeps travel expenditure ledgers organized by month and year. I reviewed the March 1885 ledger while helping with the quarterly accounts, because Mr. Alcott asked me to assist with a discrepancy in the figures, while Mr. Wade was unavailable. She looked at Dutch. He looked back with an expression she could not read except that it was not disapproving. The March 1885 ledger shows travel expenses for a cattle exchange in Cheyenne, Wyoming, from March 3rd through March 22nd. Receipts included. She held the document out. Not dropped, extended. The way you return something to its owner when you've determined it has no value. Mr. Wade was in Wyoming, she said. For the entirety of the dates, this document claims a ceremony took place in Montana. Nobody moved. Then Violet Sumner moved. She looked at the document, looked at Creech, looked at May with an expression May recognized. The expression of a woman who has been told a job would be simpler than it turned out to be and has run the calculation on what loyalty to the person who told her that is actually worth. She dropped the document in the dirt, got back on her horse, rode out through the gate without looking at anyone. One of Creech's flanking men followed immediately. The other waited 4 seconds, long enough to be readable, then followed. Creech sat his horse alone in the yard of Iron Star Ranch with the forged document in the dirt and 40 years of a man's work visible in every direction, and the woman he'd been using as a leverage point gone back down the road. He looked at May. She looked back. He looked at Byrne. Byrne had not moved or spoken. He'd been standing 10 feet behind and to May's right since she'd stepped forward, and he'd stood there the way the gatepost stood, present, rooted, saying nothing because the situation did not yet require him to say anything. But his eyes had been on Creech since Creech rode in, and the quality of that attention was the kind that made Creech's horse shift under him without any visible instruction from its rider. From the road outside came the sound of another horse. Sheriff Tom Gaines, large, deliberate, wearing the comfortable authority of a man who had been settling disputes in Millhaven County for 20 years, and had gotten efficient at reading which ones were going to resolve themselves and which ones needed a hand. He came through the gate, took one look at the scene, the document in the dirt, Creech alone on his horse, the yard full of witnesses, May standing in the center of it, and said, with the weary familiarity of a man saying a name he'd said too many times in circumstances that kept requiring cleanup, "Holt, step down, we need to talk." Creech looked at the yard one more time, at May, at Byrne, at Dutch, who was standing at the gate with his arms crossed, and the expression of a man who had been waiting for this particular conversation for some time. At the document in the dirt, which was the end of every version of this that had seemed possible when he'd ridden in, he stepped down. He went with the sheriff. He did not look back. May picked up the forged document, folded it neatly, held it. Then she walked to where Dutch was standing and handed it to him. "That should go to the marshal's office," she said. Along with the letter in the correspondence file at the outpost cabin, which I resealed after reading, Dutch took the document, looked at her for a moment, "Yes, ma'am," he said, and that was all he said, but he said it in the voice of a man who had a much longer sentence available and was choosing, wisely, not to use it. May turned. Byrne was 5 feet away. He'd crossed the yard while she was talking to Dutch, moving quietly for a man who filled the air the way he did. He was looking at her with an expression she'd seen versions of across 6 days in the cabin. But not this version. This one had no guard on it at all. "You read the marshal's letter," he said. "It was misfiled. I corrected the files. You reviewed the expense ledgers. Dutch asked me to help with the quarterly figures. I'm thorough." He looked at her for a moment. Something in the set of his jaw worked. Then, "I have never in my life seen anything like what you just did. I had the information." She looked at the gate where Creech and the sheriff had gone. It would have been strange not to use it. May, her name, said the way he'd said it occasionally in the cabin, not a call, a placement. The specific use of a name when you want someone to hear you rather than hear themselves. You had been here for 40 minutes. You walked into the middle of a yard full of strangers and took apart a fraudulent legal claim in front of everyone I employ. Your foreman and your housekeeper were the only ones who needed persuading. Everyone else was watching to see what happened. She paused, and the document was poorly made. Craddock's seal on a forgery 6 months after his arrest suggests whoever commissioned it didn't check his current status. They were in a hurry, or sloppy, or both. It wasn't hard to find. He looked at her for a long moment, a complicated expression crossing his face. Not one thing but several, arriving in sequence. "I'm still angry with you," she said. He nodded. "I know I haven't decided anything. I know that too. But I would like to go inside now." She looked at the house, at the porch, at the east-facing upper windows. "I've been outside for 6 days, and I would like to be inside for a while." He looked at her. And then, for the second time since she'd known him, something loosened in his face that had been held tight, and the laugh came through. Brief, genuine, startled out of him by the particular flatness of what she'd said, the way the most ordinary request had arrived at the end of the least ordinary morning. "Yes," he said, "come inside." Mrs. Macy led May upstairs without commentary. She was a woman who communicated through action rather than language, and who had, May understood within the first 30 seconds, been the operational center of Iron Star Ranch's domestic life for longer than most of the hands had been alive. She had watched what happened in the yard with the same expression she probably used for everything: attentive, processing, filing. She opened a door on the upper landing. Stepped back, May went in east-facing. She registered this first because of the window. 2 panes, wide, positioned to catch the morning light before it reached any other part of the house. The sky outside was still the hard blue of the post-storm morning, the mountains clear and close in the rinsed air, a bed with a white quilt, hand-stitched, the pattern a series of interlocking rings worked in cream and pale blue thread. She'd seen this pattern before. Her grandmother had made a version of it, smaller, kept in the cedar chest at the foot of her bed in the house. May had visited twice as a child and never after. The similarity was not exact and did not need to be. It landed where it landed. A wardrobe of dark oak, its doors parted slightly to show the edges of fabric inside. Calico, gingham, and against the back of the wardrobe, the corner of something that caught the light differently than cotton. She crossed to it, opened the door fully. Blue silk. A dress cut simply, without excess, the kind of thing made by someone who understood that well-made and complicated were not the same category. A washstand with a porcelain basin. A cake of soap beside it. Lavender. She found when she leaned close, the scent faint and real rather than the aggressive imitation of something that smelled like it was trying too hard. A rocking chair positioned at the window's angle. He had prepared this room for a woman he'd never met, based on 3 letters, 47 words, and whatever he'd been able to construct from what she'd told him about herself, which was not, she acknowledged, very much. And yet the soap was lavender and not rose, which was what most people assumed women wanted. The dress in the wardrobe was blue silk and also simple calico, which meant he'd thought about what she might actually want to wear, rather than what would look impressive. The rocking chair was at the window, not against the wall, positioned for someone who might want to look out rather than look in. He'd thought about her, specifically. Not a generic woman arriving to fill a function, but the particular woman who'd written about her mother's handwriting and said she was uninteresting at most things. May stood in the middle of the room for a long time. Mrs. Macy had gone. The house was quiet around her. the particular quiet of a place that had been well maintained and was waiting for something it hadn't yet had. She could hear the ranch below, the distant sound of the hands returning to work, a horse in the corral, Dutch's voice giving directions she couldn't make out through the floorboards. She crossed to the window, put her forehead against the cool glass. The valley stretched north from the house to where the mountains began in earnest. Fence lines. Cattle moving in the middle distance. The creek that had run alongside her for the past 6 days, visible as a line of darker green through the grass. His land, or what would have been simply his land 2 hours ago, and now was something she was standing inside of and needed to think about clearly. She was angry. She needed to acknowledge this cleanly before she did anything else. Not furious, not the hot, sharp anger that burned fast and was mostly fear wearing another name, the slower kind. The kind that came from having been treated as something to be studied rather than someone to be known, and from having given everything she had to give in that cabin, her time, her skills, her food, her sleep, her mother's knowledge, without being given the basic honesty of who she was giving it to. She was also, and this required the same clear-eyed acknowledgement, something else. She had known for 5 of the 6 days. She had watched him carry the weight of what he wasn't saying, and had measured the care he took with everything she gave him, and had made, over those 5 days, a set of observations that sat alongside the anger without cancelling it. Both things were true. That was the actual situation. She sat in the rocking chair. Her coat was still damp at the collar from the morning ride. She sat in the well-made room in her road-worn state and looked at the mountains and let herself be where she was. The knock came an hour later. She'd washed her face at the porcelain basin, the water cold and clean, the lavender soap exactly what it was, and combed the travel from her hair with the silver-backed brush she found on the dresser. She'd taken one of the calico dresses from the wardrobe. It fit well enough to confirm that someone had been paying attention to her letters in more ways than she'd understood. She looked at herself in the mirror above the washstand. Her face was thinner than it had been 4 days ago in Dayton. Her eyes were the same. Her mother's eyes, dark and direct, belonging to a woman who looked at things long enough to see them as they were, rather than as they were arranged to appear. "Come in," she said. Burns stood in the doorway. He'd washed, the accumulated days of the cabin and the trail gone from his face and hands, and changed into a clean shirt, though the shadow at his jaw had another day's growth since the morning. He held his hat at his side rather than in his hands, a small distinction. She noticed it. "May I come in?" he said. "It's your house. It's your room." He said it with the same plainness he applied to everything true. "If you want it to be." She looked at him. He looked back. The room between them with its interlocking rings quilt and its east-facing window and its lavender soap. "You have something to tell me," she said. "You said so last night." Before the storm interrupted, he came in, sat on the end of the bed, practical, not presumptuous. The room had one chair and she was in it. He held the hat at his side. He looked at the floor for a moment, at a knot in the pine board specifically, the particular non-focus of a man organizing what he needs to say and how to say it. 3 years back, he began. Not at the beginning she'd expected. Not Sylvia, not the advertisement, not the train ticket. Further back, Margaret had been gone 4 months. The ranch was running because Dutch ran it, and I went through the motions beside him. I couldn't find the center of the day. "You know what I mean?" "Yes," May said. She did know. She'd had weeks like that after her mother, and then months, and then they'd slowly stopped. One morning Dutch told me I needed to decide something. Not about the ranch, about what I was going to do with the part of my life that wasn't the ranch. He turned the hat once in his hand, set it on the bed beside him. He said a man who stopped building anything outside of work would eventually stop being able to find reasons to do the work. He'd seen it before. Men who outlived the people they'd been working toward. A pause. He told me to place an advertisement. I told him it was too soon. He told me he wasn't suggesting I replace Margaret. He was suggesting I give myself a reason to come in for supper. May looked at the window, at the mountains. "So you placed one," she said, the following spring. "And then Sylvia happened. Then I didn't place another one for 18 months. And when I did it the way you do something you've decided to do, but aren't willing to be hopeful about." He looked at his hat on the bed. "Your letter was the 44th I received. I read it on a Tuesday evening in November, sitting at the kitchen table after the hands had gone in for the night. I read it twice, then put it down, then picked it up and read it again. Why? Because it was the first letter in 43 that didn't tell me what the writer thought I wanted to hear. He looked at her. You wrote about a journal with flowers pressed in it. You wrote that you were competent and uninteresting. You wrote that you expected a fair chance and nothing beyond it. You didn't tell me what your hair looked like or how well you cooked or what you could offer a man in his situation. His voice had gone to the quiet place she'd heard it reach in the cabin. You wrote like someone who'd decided that whatever I was, I could either want what she was or not, and that was the only worthwhile basis for the whole enterprise. May said nothing. She remembered writing that letter. She remembered thinking that she was probably writing herself out of a response by being too direct and not particularly caring. I wrote back the same night, he said. I meant every word of it, I know. She looked at him. I could tell. He looked at her for a moment with something in his face she hadn't quite seen before. Not the open expression she'd caught glimpses of in the cabin, but something past that. Something that had gotten to the other side of a door it had been standing in front of for a long time. How long have you known who I was? The second morning, she said it plainly. The letters above the cabin door. Your horse and the marks in the pass going south on September 14th. The way you looked when I said Iron Star Ranch and needed a beat to construct your response. She looked at the window. I decided to wait. I wanted to see how you held what I gave you. He was very still, and he said. You held it carefully, she turned back to him. You didn't bank it. You didn't use it. You carried it like something you were trying to figure out how to give back. She paused. That mattered, he exhaled. A long, uneven breath, the release of something held at considerable cost. I should have told you the first morning, he said. Yes, I was afraid. I know, that's not. It's not an excuse, she said. I know that too, and you know it. Which is why you haven't tried to make it one. She looked at him steadily. I'm angry, Byrne. I want to be clear about that, because it's true and because I think you deserve to know what's actually true, rather than a managed version of it. You tested me without my knowledge or consent, and the fact that the test came from fear, rather than calculation, doesn't change what it was. He held her eyes. He didn't look away or soften, or try to find the version of what she'd said that he could argue with. He simply received it. Yes, he said. But I also want you to know something. She looked at the mountains through the window. I came here with 47 words and I was prepared to deal honestly with whatever I found. I would have dealt honestly with you from the beginning, if you'd been honest from the beginning. The version of this where you told me who you were in the past and we had 6 days in that cabin being exactly who we are. I think that version would have been fine. I know, his voice had roughened slightly. I think about that version. So do I. She looked back at him. What I need you to understand is that I'm not going to perform being less angry than I am to make this easier for either of us. And I'm not going to perform being angrier than I am to make a point. She kept her eyes on his. I'm telling you the truth because that's what I have and what I deal in. He looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was, she didn't have an exact word for it. Something that had been under enormous pressure for a long time and had finally been released from that pressure. Not joy, not relief, not the beginning of either. Something prior to both of those. The state before. There's one more thing, he said. Something I should tell you that I haven't, she waited. I was coming, he said, to the station. I left Iron Star 2 days before the 14th, so I'd have time if the weather changed. I was on the road to Millhaven when my horse stepped wrong in the pass. He paused. I didn't fail to arrive. I was stopped. May looked at him. Thought about the hoof marks she'd found in the pass on the second morning. The trail going south toward Millhaven, the direction of a man heading toward a station to meet a train. I know, she said quietly. I found the marks when I went back for my bag. He stared at her. You were already on the road, she said. Yes, she held that. Let it sit in its proper place alongside everything else. Then you should know, she said, that it matters. Not because it changes what you did in the cabin, but because it tells me something about the 47 words that I didn't know before. His throat worked. He swallowed once. She stood from the rocking chair, crossed to the window, stood with her back to him for a moment, looking at the valley, the fence lines, the cattle in the middle distance. The room, she said. Yes, you chose lavender soap, a pause. You mentioned your mother kept lavender in the herb journal, I thought. He stopped, and the rocking chair at the window rather than against the wall. You said in one of your letters that you liked to see where you were. He said it carefully. That rooms without windows felt like they were trying to make you forget the world was outside. She turned from the window, looked at him, at this enormous, careful, frightened man who had read her letters enough times to remember a sentence about windows and had positioned a chair. Accordingly, I need time, she said, to decide what I want to do with all of this. Not forever, not a long time, I don't think, but time, however long you need, it might be weeks. Then weeks she walked to the door, put her hand on the frame, turned back. Burn, he looked up. The 47 words, she said, all of them, everyone. He said it with the certainty of a man for whom this was the one thing he was completely sure of. Then we have something to work with. She looked at him for a moment longer. Come find me when you've rested. I want to see the kitchen garden before the light goes. She left him there in the room with the east-facing window and the interlocking rings quilt, and she went downstairs to start learning the shape of the place she'd walked 4 days and 12 miles and 47 words to find. The kitchen garden was better than it looked from the upper window. More organized. Someone had been thinking carefully about which plants needed shade and which needed the south-facing exposure and had positioned everything accordingly. And the result was a garden that produced well rather than merely looked well tended. May walked its rows in the late afternoon of that first day, reading it the way her mother had taught her to read any unfamiliar piece of land, looking for what it wanted, what it was suited for, what was missing that it could sustain. Mrs. Macy walked beside her, not talking, which May appreciated. She was a woman who understood that inspection required attention and attention required quiet. The yarrow section, May said, stopping at the far end of the garden where a few sparse plants struggled in ground that wasn't quite right for them. It's in too much shade. It wants more water exposure. It grows best within 20 feet of a consistent water source. Mrs. Macy looked at the yarrow, looked at May, said nothing, but the following morning there was a length of irrigation pipe laid along the garden's east edge, connecting to the house's water supply, and the yarrow section had been moved to catch both the water and the morning light. May noticed. She didn't comment. She understood that this was its own kind of conversation. The first week at Iron Star moved in the rhythm of a place that knew what it was and did not require explanation. She had said she needed time, and Byrne had said however long, and they had both meant it, which meant the days could be what they needed to be rather than what anxiety might have made them. May learned the house's logic the way she'd learned the outpost cabin's logic, by looking, by working, by finding where things were kept and what they were kept for and why. She was up before the hands most mornings. She helped Mrs. Macy in the kitchen, not as a guest helping, but as a person taking on a share of work that needed doing. Dutch watched this. He watched everything, she concluded, and had opinions about most of it that he kept to himself unless asked. At which point he provided them with the specific brevity of a man who had learned that the correct number of words for any given thing was usually fewer than people used. You going to stay? He asked her on the 4th morning. They were at the east fence, where she'd walked to look at the mountain view at first light and found him there already, doing what he apparently did at this time every day, which was stand at this specific fence and look at the mountains. He didn't look at her when he said it. I don't know yet, she said. He nodded. Fair enough, that was the whole conversation. She found she respected him for it. Byrne gave her space. This was deliberate. She could see the deliberateness of it, the effort it cost him, the way he positioned himself at the edge of her days rather than the center. Present, available, not pressing. He came to meals. He found her in the evenings in the spot she'd started to have. The kitchen garden at dusk, the east porch in the mornings, the library after supper, where she'd discovered he had considerably more books than she'd expected, and several that she had strong opinions about. You've read this one, she said one evening, holding up a well-worn volume of natural history she'd found on the library shelf. The binding was cracked at several points that suggested repeated opening to the same pages. 3 times, he was in the chair across from her, the one that was clearly his usual chair, worn at the armrests in the specific pattern of someone who sat with their elbows out. The section on soil composition is wrong in 2 places, but the rest of it is sound. Which places? He told her. She had an opinion about one of them. They disagreed, specifically and with interest, for 20 minutes, and then agreed, specifically, about everything else. She went to bed that night thinking that a man who read natural history 3 times and found the errors was probably someone she could talk to for a long time without running out of things to say. She did not say this to him. It was not yet the kind of thing she was saying. On the 7th day she went into Millhaven with Mrs. Macy for supplies. She had not been into town since she'd arrived, had not, she realized, set a foot beyond the ranch boundaries since Burns' horse had carried them through the gate. The town was larger than Millhaven Station had suggested. A proper main street, a general store, a post office, a building that served as courthouse and meeting hall on alternating days of the week. People looked at her. Of course they did. The valley was small and word traveled at the speed of human interest, which was faster than most other things. She felt the attention and met it straight on, because the alternative was to avoid it, which was a posture she'd never found useful. At the general store, a woman about her age said, "You're the one who was at Iron Star." "Not a question, yes," May said. "The one who took apart Creech's paper in the yard. I had information that was relevant. Anyone with the same information could have done the same." The woman looked at her with an expression that suggested she was not entirely convinced of this, but was willing to let it stand. "Creech has been pulling that residency business for 3 years, she said. 3 years of women coming through on the correspondence trains and him waiting at the station like a spider." She paused. "Nobody pushed back before. I imagine it's difficult to push back when you've just arrived and don't know the territory," May said. "And you did. I had time to learn a few things before I came in." The woman introduced herself as Clara Hendricks, wife of the man who ran the feed and grain operation at the south end of town. She had the handshake of someone who worked with her hands and didn't soften it for the introduction. May liked her immediately. By the time she and Mrs. Macy had completed their supply run, she had been introduced to 6 more women and 2 men, all of whom knew exactly who she was and had things to say about Creech that ranged from measured to emphatic. The sheriff's inquiry into Creech's conduct over the past 3 years was already underway, which she'd known from Dutch. What she hadn't known was how many people in Millhaven had been waiting for something exactly like that inquiry. She rode back to Iron Star in the wagon thinking about community as a thing that had shape and weight and was not the same as geography. She had grown up in a city that contained hundreds of thousands of people and had been largely invisible in it. This valley held perhaps 800 souls, and she had been present in it for 7 days and was already not invisible. That was worth something. She was still deciding how much. On the 14th day, Byrne found her in the kitchen garden at dusk. She'd been there for an hour, doing what she'd taken to doing in the late afternoons, working with her hands in the soil while the light changed, thinking without directing her thoughts anywhere particular, letting them settle where they would. He came around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her. She looked up. "I have something to tell you," he said. "The last thing. The one I haven't said." She sat back on her heels, looked at him. He came to where she was and crouched down beside the yarrow she'd relocated to the better light. He looked at the plant rather than at her. "Dutch told me something the morning I left for Millhaven," he said. "Before I rode out. He said that if I was going to do this, go meet you, bring you here, I had to be willing to be known, not just known as the man who owned the land. Known as whoever I actually was underneath the land." He touched one of the yarrow stems lightly, turning a leaf over. He said, "You can't ask someone to trust you if you won't let them see you." And that performing trustworthiness from a distance wasn't the same as actually offering it. "He was right," May said. "He usually is." He looked at the plant. "I left that morning intending to be honest with you from the moment I met you. I decided, on the road, that whatever had happened with Sylvia, I was going to come to that station and introduce myself as who I was, and see what happened." He paused. "And then I woke up in the pass and you were there and you didn't know my name, and He stopped. "I've thought about why I made that choice, and I can't give you an explanation that satisfies me. I can tell you that it came from fear. I can tell you that it was wrong. I can tell you that every day in that cabin, watching you teach and work and manage and think, I understood more clearly what it cost you to not know who you were giving those things to." May looked at his profile. At the jaw she'd stitched around 6 days ago, the scar at his forehead already fading toward the thing it would be for the rest of his life. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You've said that several times, in ways that suggest you know more than I've told you." "I do," she met his eyes. I knew most of it in the cabin. The rest I've been understanding since I got here." And she stood, brushed the soil from her hands, looked at the mountains which were going purple as the light failed, the peak still catching the last gold above the shadow line. "And I came here looking for a roof and 4 walls and somewhere that was mine," she said. That was true. But it wasn't the whole truth. The whole truth is that I came looking for someone worth knowing. Someone who'd look at me the way you need to look at something if you're actually going to know it. All the way, not just the parts that are easy. She looked at him. I found that. The parts that are harder are real too. But I found what I came looking for. He looked at her, his face completely clear of everything he'd been holding. Just his face in the September evening in front of the mountains. "Then stay," he said. The simplest version of everything he'd been trying to say for 2 weeks. "I'll stay," she said. They went inside. They sat on the west porch as the last light left the sky. 2 chairs. 2 cups of tea she'd made from the dried yarrow she'd brought from the outpost cabin. The same preparation she'd given him in the dark of the 4th night when his fever was at its height. She hadn't explained this. He held his cup with both hands and drank it without asking. She told him about the hoof marks in the pass, how she'd found them on the 2nd morning when she went back for her bag, and what they'd told her, and how she'd carried that knowledge through the rest of the time in the cabin without saying it, because she was waiting for him to get there himself. He listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "You were giving me the chance to do the right thing," he said. "I was watching to see if you would." She looked at the first star appearing in the east. "There's a difference, is there? One is generous. The other is honest." She looked at him. "I try to be honest." He looked at the star, then at the mountains, dark shapes now against the darkening sky. Then at her. He put his hand on the arm of her chair. Not on her hand, on the wood beside her hand. The specific restraint of a man who understood that closeness was not the same as claim. She moved her hand. Let her fingers rest on the back of his, lightly, the way you set something down on a surface you're still learning. He went very still. The stillness of someone being careful with something they can't afford to get wrong. 47 words, she said. "Yes, everyone. His voice from somewhere low and certain. "And every day after, if you'll let me." The evening settled around them. A meadowlark final and bright, somewhere out in the pasture. The distant sound of the creek she'd followed for 6 days, still running, still cold, still certain of where it was going. The fire in the house behind them throwing warm light through the window onto the porch boards. She was not where she'd expected to be when she bought the ticket in Dayton. She was not who she'd expected to be. Neither was he. And the gap between expected and actual was not loss. It was the shape of a thing that had been built from what was real rather than what was planned. She thought that was probably how it was supposed to work. She drank her yarrow tea. He held her hand. The mountains held their ground in the dark. The stars came on one at a time, and then all at once, the way they did out here, as if they'd been waiting for someone to sit still long enough to notice. Spring came to the Bitterroot the way it always did. Not gradually, not gently, but all at once, winter releasing its grip on a single warm afternoon in April and the green following within days. The creek ran loud with snowmelt. The aspens came back in the order they'd left, the lower elevations first, working uphill over 2 weeks that felt, from inside them, like watching something return you'd been uncertain would. May's herb garden was the first thing she'd claimed at Iron Star. Not requested, claimed, the south-facing patch behind the kitchen, where the roof runoff kept the soil workable. She'd assessed it in October. Spent the winter reviewing the catalogs that came through the Millhaven Post, ordered seeds that arrived in late March in a paper package from a grower in Missouri. By the end of April, the first rows were showing green. She was on her knees between the yarrow and the dock on a Tuesday morning when she stopped working. Set down the trowel. Put both hands flat against the earth for a moment, feeling the warmth the soil had stored, the specific depth of it, the way the warmth went down further than just the surface now. Then she moved one hand to the front of her apron and held it there. Listening, still, Dutch came around the corner of the house with a post he was taking to the lower pasture fence. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her hands, at where they were, at the expression on her face. He had been with the Wade family for 30 years. He was very good at reading what he saw. "Morning, Mrs. Wade," he said, the same voice he used for everything. Steady, proceeding. "Morning, Dutch," she said. He went on with his post. Neither of them said anything more about it. She stayed in the garden a while longer, her hands in the soil. The yarrow coming in strong this year, in the right location, with the right light and water. The dock settling into the ground as if it had always been here. The chamomile she'd planted from seed, showing its first small growth along the southern border. She thought about her mother standing at the stove in the boarding house kitchen on Sunday afternoons, mixing cornmeal in the chipped blue bowl that was the one thing they'd brought from the house before that, about a pressed flower inside a journal that was now on the shelf of a library in a house in the Bitterroot Valley. About a train ticket bought on the strength of 47 words, and a valise with 3 working latches, and a mountain pass in September, and a hand reaching up from under a granite slab. Keep moving forward, May girl. Her mother's voice, exact and clear. The Lord helps those who help themselves, she had. She was burned, came out at dusk with 2 cups. The yarrow tea she'd taught him to make in the first week, dried leaves steeped 5 minutes, not more, the water just off the boil, and he'd been making it without being asked ever since. The way he'd started doing other things she'd mentioned once and hadn't mentioned again. He sat on the low fence beside the garden, handed her a cup. She took it and stood beside him, and they looked at the mountains in the last light. After a while she set her cup on the fence post and took his free hand and placed it flat against the front of her apron. His enormous hand, the hand that had closed around her wrist in the dark of the fever night and held on. The hand that had lain flat on the blanket and received half a biscuit from a woman who didn't know his name. She placed it there and held it there with both of hers. He felt what she was telling him. She watched the knowledge arrive in his face, the moment it landed, and then the moment it settled, and then the thing that opened behind it. Something she'd seen glimpses of across the months. Now all of it at once, he said. Oh, one word, just that. And then, like a man hearing something he'd been listening for without knowing he was listening. Oh, different, the second time. Entirely different. His hand stayed where she'd placed it. She kept hers over it. Above them the first stars were appearing in the east, the same stars she'd watched from the porch in September, arriving in the same order, the Bitterroot sky doing what it always did, vast and precise and perfectly indifferent to everything happening on the ground below it, and therefore the ideal backdrop for all of it. We have some trust built, she said. We do. His voice from somewhere she'd been learning the location of all winter. More to build, always, he said this without complaint. The voice of a man who had figured out that the ongoing work was not the obstacle to the thing. It was the thing. She looked at the mountains. He looked at her. The garden gave off the sharp, clean smell of growing things doing exactly what they were made to do. Behind them the house was lit and warm. Her mother's journal was on the library shelf, beside the natural history book with its 2 wrong sections. The rocking chair was at the east window where it had always been, positioned for someone who wanted to see where they were. The 47 words were in the drawer of the table beside the bed, worn soft at the creases from handling, read so many times the fold lines had become part of the paper. Still true. Everyone, still true, and now the beginning of a longer story than 47 words could hold.